Dave,
Sorry, I had it muted.
what up? Are we recording?
No.
Hey, you got a screwdriver?
Yeah.
Does he know it's on YouTube?
Yeah. Yeah, Gino, we're on YouTube now. Hold on, let me pause it.
Yeah, hold on. Your face is on YouTube.
Why not? YouTube.
What up?
Give me a follow on Twitter. I've been Gino Matias Smith. Give me a follow on Twitter. Great content. Yo. Dave, who going next?
It's about to be Joey, then it's gonna be
Zach.
no, Zach's going last.
Oh, Kyle.
Yes, sir.
What does he mean by NFL total access in the group?
Not sure.
Oh man. All right. He said he has another. All right, I'm like this.
Y'all in
No, you're
here?
good, right? There we go.
Can't hear you.
You hear me now?
Still can't
Oh,
hear
no.
you.
I can hear you.
It's weird.
Is the YouTube link working, Cody?
Let me check it out.
Yeah, YouTube's up.
It's a new one. Just check my bio on,
Yeah, I got it.
on Instagram.
Got about 10 people up right now.
We're rolling, dog.
Yep.
All right. Give it a few more minutes and then we'll get cracking at this thing.
Absolutely. All right, Joey, I guess on you. We'll start here soon. I'll share the screen over to you. You'll take it away.
All right, sounds good, David. Appreciate you. Share my screen quick. So appreciate everybody stopping in and checking out these presentations. It's funny how this idea originated. It was more for staff development than anything, and then the idea of bringing it to the public came to light, and we decided to make it a deal where we put it out there for everyone to see. You know, I think it gives good exposure, and it's a good developmental tool for people to talk in front of people and research things that maybe they don't feel extremely comfortable about talking about, and putting it out there in the open. So we had a great lineup of speakers earlier. I think my guys did a great job, and Cody did a phenomenal job. We have a great lineup, another 4 speakers at the end of the day today to finish this thing out. I hope you guys benefit from it. I mean, if you could take one thing out of any of these presentations, I think they're worthwhile to watch. Today, I'm going to talk about isometric considerations for college football, theory and application. All right, something that's kind of become the popularity has definitely increased of isometric exercises, specifically you look at today with our current situation, a lot of people don't have means to do traditional weightlifting. So they've kind of relied on these ready homemade exercises and modalities, and some that's become extremely popular is overcoming isometrics because of, again, the practicality of it, the complexity of it, and then obviously the creativity of it, because you could essentially make an isometric exercise, specifically overcoming isometric exercise, at a majority of your household items, like a door frame, a towel, whatever. But let's get into the nuts and bolts of it, right? Disclaimer: I am not a doctor or physiologist. I am not an expert in this specific facility or the specific scope of what we're going to talk about today. I am a general practitioner, so I got to give the disclaimer. Many of these theories and concepts were developed by guys a lot smarter than I am, a lot smarter, and everything I'm talking about today essentially is just through my scope, how I interpret it, and how we implement it, and how we use it. That's it. But again, I'm the creator of none and the borrower of many. All right. So Christian Thibodeau, Max Shamarza, Matt Van Dyke, Cal Dietz, Alan Bishop. If you're looking for more information on it, I highly suggest you buy Max and Matt's book. It's extremely thorough, and I reference it a ton. I highly suggest you go reach out and get triphasic training. It kind of, almost is cultish now how people lean on this book because of how good the information in it is. And then high threshold muscle building by Christian Thibodeau. He does a fantastic job talking about a lot of the concepts we're going to talk about today. Right. So what is an isometric contraction, right? We got to boil it down to the bare basics. All right. And essentially it's a muscle, or muscles are producing force without movement, right? An isometric contraction of the muscle occurs when tension developed within the muscle is equal to the external load imposed upon the muscle. So the easiest way to think of an isometric contraction is for you to go up against the wall and push as hard as you can, right? There's absolutely zero movement, even though you're still contracting, even though there's still tensile, there's fascial tensile strength being developed, which we'll get into later, but there's absolutely no movement. Okay? So again, the definition, it's in between. Okay, it's the wedge between eccentric and concentric actions. Okay, and we'll get into the trans break, my little drag racing metaphor. But again, it's you have these three muscle contractions, right? That Gino hit upon, and Sean hit upon. You have an eccentric contraction, an isometric contraction, a concentric contraction in every dynamic movement. Okay, so again, it's the bridge between that eccentric, that lengthening, and again, that concentric action, which is that shortening, again, how I think of it, absorbing force to creating propulsive force, okay? Right? We think that the muscles aren't, again, that there's not smaller micro contractions going on in that muscle fiber just because we're in a locked position, but there are. So that sliding filament theory is still in play. They're just smaller muscle contractions going on, right? And then isometric stability is required to some extent in every movement. So us sitting here currently, there is muscles in our body that are isometrically contracting. I know Greg Cook hit upon it with phasic and tonic muscles, right? So a lot of our muscles in our back, again, are isometrically contracting at all times to maintain our posture, right? So again, our neck muscles, when our arms are just hanging out our sides, our arm, our biceps, triceps, our deltoids, all these other muscles are working isometrically. So we have isometric contractions going on all day long, right? And then again, there's a critical role in executing movements in a synchronized, efficient, and powerful as force transferred through muscle action. So again, as we go through this stretch shortening cycle and understand that eccentric force is, the importance of all of these dynamic contractions, okay, it's also important to understand that the more synchronized it is, the more force demands are going to be, and that we want to continue to create powerful movements through all three of these phases. So essentially getting this kinetic energy to transfer all the way through these dynamic muscle coordinations so that we don't ooze, like I'll talk to and allude to later, or lose or leak energy as we go about creating this force, right? And this is the famous V. So if you've read triphasic training, you've probably seen it before. You've probably seen it all over the internet, right? And it's this concept that elite athletes move through these three muscle coordinations at a much steeper and faster rate than advanced athletes even. Okay, so again, as you can see, The eccentric phase is much sharper. Isometric phase, again, is able, like we'll get into, is able to withstand and transmit these forces to concentric action. So we're able to absorb force, we're able to hold on to this force and then redistribute it in a way that's going to be propulsive in nature. Okay, moving on. What are the benefits? What are the benefits of isometric training, right? So we look at, there's 3 specific ones. So you have the structural adaptations. So anytime that you can increase time under tension, you're going to see these structural adaptations that occur. So you get hypertrophy. So again, increasing time under tension, and we'll specifically talk about our long duration isometrics that we get into later on that can increase specific hypertrophy in specific body parts and specific areas, right? We look at fascial length, right? So increasing fascial length, all right? And then we look at also the tendon stiffness that occurs with isometric training, right? So stiffening of the spring, which is extremely important because we'll talk about, again, athletic abilities, what makes people special, and bouncy, being able to be bouncy is one of them. So again, why is tendon stiffness important? Because again, it could also make you a more efficient athlete. So when you talk about running economy, people that have more efficient tendons, more stiffer tendons, right? You're not going to use as much contractile strength as you run, right? And then you get into the metabolic adaptations, right? So increased tolerance of metabolic buildup, right? So again, we get into being able to combat lactate, keeping the proper pH levels inside that muscle itself, and really, basically making you a more robust athlete as far as from that consideration from a metabolic standpoint. And then you talk about the neural adaptations, right? So you talk about post-action potentiation, right? Brain function, and then that muscle coordination that comes along with any neural adaptation, right? Being a more coordinated athlete, firing more motor neurons per muscle, right? Where does it occur in sports, right? So, where does isometrics fall in the line of sports performance, right? So you see it in all actions, right? Because we know that in any dynamic movement, there's going to be 3 phases of contractile properties, right? You're going to have eccentric, isometric, and then concentric. But majority of where I see it is in the amortization phase or in the stance phase of either in running or in agility training, okay? You will also see it occur in grappling sports, which football in the trenches can be considered a grappling sport because, due to the nature and demand of the physicality in there. So again, it's this idea that you see it in running. Majority of the time, you're going to see it in running, but you'll see it a ton in grappling sports as well, as they're trying to hold positions. Gymnastics, you'll see it a ton because, again, they're holding positions. So anytime you see really an athlete come to a stop, that's a high demand for isometric strength, okay? Again, what we're going to talk about, the stretch shortening cycle, I think Coach Gino did a fantastic job earlier in his presentation of kind of nailing down what it is. Right? You look at the different phases, right? So the lengthening phase, the amortization phase, and then obviously the concentric phase, okay? Or the shortening phase, all right? So force production is equivalent to ground reaction forces of landing. That is where isometric actions occur. So in C, you can see that we are transmuting or we're putting the same amount of force in the ground as the ground is electing on us, right? So again, why is it important? If we can't maintain, or if the ground puts too much force, we might lose position, right? Or if we're oozing energy, okay, this can lead to postural issues. And then you look at the cyclical nature of a lot of the activities I previously mentioned. It could further disrupt the coordination and firing of other muscle groups if we're not sufficient in being able to hold this energy, right? Again, it's responsible for the rapid transfer of energy within a muscle tendon structure, okay? So if we're not strong isometrically, but we're getting expressed to high levels of force, this could end up in catastrophic failure, such as a torn Achilles or a torn calf muscle or other damage to these muscles, or to other damage, period. And then again, something to definitely hit upon, and this has kind of come to light as research has really gone into isometric training, is high-speed, low-amplitude movements. The tendon will deform during the eccentric portion. What people are suggesting, specifically Franz Bosch's camp, the muscles will have to maintain length and contract isometrically. So again, the need for isometric strength as these tendons deform, and then the fatigue resistant as it occurs over and over and over, because it's a repetitive movement, right? Because in all sports we run, right? So this is repetitive movement. So again, the duration of practices as we fatigue, the importance of isometric exercises are definitely going to be a lot higher, right? And then again, to get back into the stress shortening cycle. So again, you could see in that coiled up spring, essentially is going to be our amortization phase, that isometric phase. So again, if that spring isn't strong enough, it's going to deform, okay? Or it's going to leak energy, right? And then it's not going to be able to have as much propulsive force or the contractile force, the extension force that you would see if it was a strong isometric spring, being able to hold that, right? And then the stress shortening cycle phases are experienced during a hop, right? So this is an example, right? So this occurs with every dynamic movement to some extent. So you can see all three phases in this specific diagram. All right. And again, all right, what do we want to avoid? And we all see it. We all see it. And as soon as you say ooze, I guarantee there's athletes that come in mind that lack stiffness. And essentially, this could be kind of attributed to a lot of reasons. It's a multifactorial problem. But at the same time, I think isometric exercises, isometric training, I'm not saying that it's the holy grail, because it's not. It's just another tool in the toolbox. But I think it can aid in a lot of these postural issues, in a lot of these stiffness issues. I think, again, it's just another tool to lean on as we look at the problems that we see in our populations of athletes. Okay, so again, we want to avoid the ooze. You see it, that foot hits the ground when someone's running. They spend their ground contact times are elongated. You know, you see weird shapes. You see postural breakdown, and then obviously you'll start to see anterior pelvic tilt as you work up the chain, which will lead to that overstride and issues. Okay, or you see it in an old lineman that has a great initial punch, right, and then they're trying to hold position and they lose that position, either because of it's fatiguing in nature and they haven't been exposed to that type of fatigue, or because again they're just not strong enough to hold those forces isometrically in that specific situation. So again, we're just trying to fight the ooze, okay? Where is it prevalent? Dr. Wayan, and how it applies, again, you talk about the stress shortening cycle and then the need for isometric and isometric stiffness. And like I previously alluded to, is people are starting to question, again, that isometric contractions play a larger part in running and in the stress shortening cycle, especially because those tendons deform, right? So what does this two-spring model say? But what are the two elements that it specifically hits on? And it's high limb velocity pre-impact, and it's that stiff landing. So again, if we're not strong isometrically on that landing, if we cannot contribute to that stiff landing with our contractile properties, we're going to ooze energy. We're going to ooze force, and we're not going to be as we're not going to have as powerful or as forceful of a contraction concentrically moving into the next one, right? Then what does science say about this, right? So again, it alludes back to what I previously talked about, which was the single leg Roman chair hold is more effective than the Nordic hamstring curl in improving hamstring strength, endurance, in Gaelic football players. Basically, what this research article stated is the isometric fatigue ability, the ability to resist fatigue isometrically, contributed to preserving hamstring injuries, right? Or excuse me, preserving the hamstring to avoid injuries versus the Nordic curl itself. So again, alluding to this fact that, all right, we're in the stress shortening cycle, in these repetitive movements, we are contributing isometrically to that stress shortening cycle, and that the ability to be more robust to fatigue is actually an extremely important attribute to space, and that you can only get through isometrically training itself, right? And this is what it stated. It has recently been argued that muscle fibers of hamstrings remain predominantly isometric during the swing phase of high-speed running, despite an overall increase in muscle tendon unit length. A fatigue-induced reduction in force output from muscle fibers will result in an ability of the muscle fibers to remain isometric, with a resultant increase in length and micro-damaging occurs. So basically, essentially a strain. This mechanism may explain the association described between fatigue and injury, okay? The results of the current study suggest that isometric strength training may positively impact on injury risk by improving hamstring strength, endurance, and modifying the potential injury process. So again, you can see the benefit of these isometric training modalities as you avoid that fatigue that will result in increased lengthening and the possibility of micro damage or strains and tears in that hamstring. Okay, and we talked about the balance. Where does it lie on the hierarchy of athletic development? And it's right there up at the top, right under speed, right? So we always want to increase our elasticity and reactive strength. And I think as far as when it comes to explosive isometrics and that you're going to get a high bang for your buck as far as it pertaining to training the elastic reactive components of strength training, right? And then again, how does it affect structural adaptations, right? So these are different studies, right? Effects on different isometric contractions on tendon elasticity in the human quad. And basically what it said is there was an increase in stiffness of the tendon complex, okay? So again, making that quad tendon a little bit more robust, right? More studies, the effects of long-term isometric training on core stiffness, right? We all do planks. Do we know why we do planks? Do we know why we like planks, right? So again, we all utilize all of these isometric exercises all the time, but what does science tell us about it, right? It is important since increased core stiffness enhances load-bearing ability, right? So again, you talk about proxial stability equals distal speed or distal velocity, right? So some that Gray Cook always talked about all the time, and I know Charlie Weingroff hits on all the time, is this idea of trying to shoot a cannon from a canoe, right? If something's not stable, you can't create velocity. So again, why is it the structural adaptations, and you can see with isometric contractions, they improve the overall tensile strength in the abdomen, in the lower back, in the upper back, it allowing you to have a better platform for more explosive, violent movements from a distal standpoint, right? So this may explain the efficacy reported for back and knee injury reduction. So again, the more stable we are, okay, the less injuries that may occur because we'll be in better positions from a postural standpoint, from a biomechanical standpoint. All right, so again, moving on to metabolic buffering, right? So we all know, and we've all heard this lactic acid buildup and all this, and coaches say it all the time. Well, isometrics, the tissue can be trained to become more efficient with clearance of metabolites, metabolites, or to become increasingly tolerant due to the implementation of specific isometric training. So again, isometric training can expose you to high levels of acidity in the muscle, right? Because of the long duration of it. And again, it's a safe way to do it, which again will give you more lactate buffering capacity, which is extremely important in specific sports and in specific training periods throughout the year, right? So again, effects of high intensity intermittent, this is more science telling you that essentially that it does a good job. Isometric training does a great job of increasing lactate buffering capacity, okay? And then you look at the neural side of it, which is extremely important, right? So you look from a neural side, all right, we're trying to increase force production by activating more muscle units, right? Maximally activating more muscle units, and again, producing greater force per fiber. And then we're also looking to, again, get the switching on and off of muscle groups, the coordination of muscle groups, synergistic working of muscle groups. So then you talk about how does isometrics fit into this? So like you look from an intermuscular coordination standpoint, you talk about co-contraction, so antagonistic, antagonistic. So there's this gigantic tug of war battle going on between these muscles, which can be beneficial from a stiffness standpoint, right? And then here it is, again, the evidence of altered corticomotor excitability following targeted activation of glute. And essentially, again, this is exactly what we saw is more motor unit, more maximal motor unit recruitment, and then that co-contraction going on, all right? So how do you program it, right? Because it's like this crazy idea, and there's almost like this idea that if you're not following this triphasic model, you're doing it wrong, right? So again, to me, it's just another tool in the toolbox, right? And anytime you talk about exercises or programming in general, they all abide by this specific program, this idea that you got to manipulate program variables, right? So we're going to look at format, frequency, volume, intensity, the mode, and then what's the recovery process behind it. So in any exercise, I think these are the variables that you have to harp on and you have to sit down and look at before you just throw something into your program. right? So how do we integrate it? We integrate it in a high-low system. So again, on our high days, we're gonna try to maximize our high days, right? We want our high days to be high, so we want to match stresses. So those are going to be the days that we implement maybe some PAP strategies using and utilizing isometric exercise, or maybe that's where we just incorporate isometric exercises in general, just by themselves, to drive for either from an explosive overcoming or an explosive yielding, right? You look at our low days, okay? Our low days, what we might do is those are where our longer duration isometrics will fit in, you know, and again, because again, the hypertrophy aspect of it, and then the structural aspect of it from the fascial lengthening that could come along with that, or the lactate buffering capacity from a metabolic standpoint, which fits in on those low days where we're trying to drive peripheral stress, not central nervous system. Because again, at the end of the day, we're trying to maximize our rate of our return on investment. Right. So when you look at any exercise, right, we're going to start simple and we're going to move to complex. As we move through this continuum, the exercise modality will change, and this is where that variable, where either is from a volume prescription, an intensity prescription, a change variation in the exercise itself. We will start simple and we'll move to more complex methods. All right, and then just following suit, just like that, just with the previous slide, is we'll move from general to specific with all these exercises again. So specific to the sport, and some of, when I mean specific, I don't mean the sport itself. I mean as specific as we can be in the weight room. So I don't want people to think that, you know, we're doing isometric work, you know, in O-line Indy. But again, general to specific. And how does this look? All right. So again, you take a simple concept, a simple exercise, like maybe like an isometric hold during a hyper. And you can make it more complex by taking that foot off. You can make it even more complex. Again, you're working a similar muscle group with this sprinter bridge with alternating leg holds where you're going back and forth. So you added some a dynamic component to it to make it a little bit more complex. And then you could add an explosive element to it, which you can see in this bottom right screen, where this guy is literally hopping. Now he is hopping from leg to leg, switching those legs, again, adding that explosive modality to it, again, increasing the complexity of it. And then from general to specific, right? So you look at, we're in a split squat position where we're just in a split squat hold to elevating the front foot to where now there's more force on that front leg, all right? And then again, more postural demand because of the surface area being knocked down to 1. Then you get into a loaded foot, front or back foot elevated hold. And then you could see the A hold on the wall, which is specific to running. Again, is it exactly the same? No, but are we just trying to get in the ballpark? Yes. And I think that's where, again, you're never going to be able to mimic the exact movement itself, but can you mimic some of the properties that go along with enhancing the specific movement? I think that's where it lies. And it kind of boils down to that dynamic correspondence, right? It may not be the exact exercise, but is it going to benefit the exercise you're going to, or you're chasing after enhancing? Okay, or should I say movement that you're trying to enhance, not exercise, right? Because we're trying to enhance movements, not exercise. All right. So moving on, how do you scale intensity and volume with isometrics? Okay, and with anything, it boils down to this: there's an inverse relationship between volume and intensity. The more intense the exercise is, the less duration it's going to be, and the less volume you're going to prescribe. All right. So again, it just falls along with all of those other variables that we spoke upon earlier. All right. What are the guidelines for it? Me, the way that I program isometrics is very similar to how I program Olympic lifting as it pertains to our explosive overcoming and yielding isometrics. Okay. So again, we're going to use Preplin's chart again because it's a tested and true method that's stood the test of time in prescribing, right? And prescribing the right intensities, and then obviously getting the optimal ranges. All right, so how does that look? Right, we look at classification of central versus peripheral. So again, you know, just trying to classify these exercises, and the way I classify exercises again in this high-low model that we use is I want to see where it lies as far as total motor unit involvement. All right, so in the chart that you'll see on the next page, again, any percentage is going to be that total motor unit involvement and how it correlates to this specific chart and these specific exercises. how I view them, right? So when you get into it, into intensity classifications, okay? So I put some examples, and we'll get into classifications of exercises, of specific exercises isometrically later on. These are just some examples, but you can see, again, so you look at depth jumps, which is a yielding exercise, right? So again, absorbing energy and then redistributing, okay? So that isometric contraction is more absorbing, so that'd be a yielding exercise, right? So depending upon the box height, okay, it could fall in any of those rep ranges from 70 to 100 plus, right? You do a super maximal depth drop, okay, and land on one leg, that's going to be well over 100% as far as relative intensity. And you look at pause weighted jumps, the same idea. As you increase the weight, the isometric contraction, the force within that isometric contraction is going to be a lot higher. Okay, and then you move into trap bar kettlebell drops, something that Corey Schlesinger has made extremely popular, which I like a lot, is this explosive yielding exercise. You could see, again, depending upon the weight of the trap bar, the weight of the kettlebell, and the length of the isometric contraction, it could go all the way up to 100. And then you talk about those sprinter bridge hop-ins, again, ranking 70 to 90% as far as relative motor unit involvement. All right, then you look at explosive overcoming, and these are going to be more intense in nature in general, right? So you talk about your rack pulls or your pin pulls, okay? Those are going to be, 80 plus. You look at, again, the pin presses. So you look at upper body pin presses, it's going to be in that 70 to 90 range. You look at those pin presses lower body wise. So those driving that bar up in there in a squat, whether it's, a full squat or from a quarter squat position, or from, again, the creativity of it is because it's joint specific is through the roof, but you can see those are extremely taxing on that central nervous system. And then you talk about wall or sled A-hold. So again, maximum where the sled doesn't move. Obviously a wall isn't going to move unless you're the Hulk, but seeing it in that range between 70 and 100%, depending upon the duration, right? Then you look at long duration, right? So a goblet squat hold, right? That's going to be in that lower spectrum. Same with the split squat holds, body weight, push-up holds are going to be down relative. So anything, again, you see this inverse relationship consistently, and I can go on and on and on about the different percentages, but there's an inverse relationship between, again, volume and intensity. And the way that we calculate volume is obviously is going to be the duration of the exercise. So, and you'll see this in the prescription of how we prescribe times for these isometric exercises. Okay, so again, look at the top, the classification, the intensity relative to the exercise. So, anything in that 100 plus range, we're only going to do 2 to 3 sets. All right. You get the 80, 90, you're going to go 2 to 5 sets, 70 to 80, 3 to 6, 60 to 70, 3 to 6, and then again, 50 to 60, 3 to 6, right? Anything 70 or above, we're not going to go more than 10 seconds. Okay, we're not going to go more than 10 seconds. Again, because of the extreme nature of these exercises, you could risk injury doing these exercises if you have that intent, and again, you're trying to drive, you're on that upper end of the intensity classification of exercise. Okay, so explosive yielding, you see it 7 to 10 in that 70 to 80 range, 80 to 90, we're going 5 to 7 seconds, 90 to 100, we're at 3 seconds, 100 plus, we're at about 3 seconds. Okay, same thing with the explosive, 7 to 10, 5 to 7, 3 and 3. Now you look when we get to these longer duration yielding, right? So if you increase the intensity, we're gonna be anywhere from 15 to 20 seconds. That could be a heavy suitcase hold, or a farmer's walk, or a super maximal plank, right? As soon as you remove some of that intensity, the duration can go up. It could be 30 plus seconds, right? We've all prescribed, we probably all prescribed the plank for a minute. That's exactly what it would correlate to, right? So what's what? Exercise classification, right? So again, this is straight out of the book, Matt Van Dyke and Max Marshall wrote, and I didn't want to butcher and try to come up with my own when they did such a great job of classification of these exercises, right? So you got isolated and you got complex exercises. So essentially, an isolated exercise is a single muscle group versus a complex, which is multiple muscle groups working synergistically together, right? You got long muscle versus short muscle. So think arm extended, holding a bar, versus arm contracted, holding a bar, right? You got long duration, like we spoke of earlier. So, and then you got explosive, like we spoke of earlier. And you saw how we differentiate between the prescription of how many seconds and time duration of sets that we'll do there. And then you have, again, you have these co-contractions where there's this extreme tug of war. You have this overcoming, okay, which the way I think of it is propulsive force. So trying to create propulsive force. And then I think of yielding, okay, as the opposite as of absorbing force, the ability to absorb force, okay? And again, yielding, well, like what do some of these exercises look like? And, you know, a lot of what we do is yielding, right? So again, you look at a change of direction movement, regardless what movement, at some point in time, you're gonna have some yielding isometric forces involved, right? When you land in a jump, there's yielding isometric forces involved. If you did a rapid RDL and stopped at the bottom, there's a yielding isometric forces involved, okay? So again, it's this ability to absorb force and then hold that position without moving, okay? So that's how I conceptualize yielding, right? I look at overcoming as producing, right? So again, we're producing force against an external object that is producing the same amount or if not more force on us so that we cannot move it. All right, so again, you look at these pin pulls, these rack presses. You see a lot of these exercises that we'll get into further on how we actually implement them. But again, maximum intent on these exercises, extremely taxing neurally. But again, it's this producing of the force, right? You look at isolated, okay, isolated. So again, if he's just to hold the dumbbell in that specific area, we're talking about a short, isolated isometric contraction. So again, it's just a single muscle group. Obviously, there's more, there's forearm and his bicep are working, but it's isolated to a specific region of his body versus being globally, right? And then we look at joint specific. So you look at long. So if I were to do overhead carries, I saw Alan Bishop was doing overhead carries yesterday. Again, that's actually technically a upper body isometric exercise. And it's joint specific to the long, being long, right? To being extended versus short, which is contracted. Okay. You see Chinese lifters do this all the time where they'll do these heavy snatch holds. Okay. So they'll stand up and hold a super maximal weight for up to 5 to 7 seconds. Again, trying to be specific to that long joint. All right. And then you look at short. So again, in this example, okay, it's joint specific and it's short. Looking at the hamstring, right? The hamstring is contracted. So if they were to hold this isometric contraction, again, it's that muscle is shortening and we're holding it in that short position. Okay, and then how do we use it, right? We look at it's another tool in the toolbox. You know, I don't want to elude or give this misinterpretation that our entire program is based around isometrics. I mean, if I were to break it down as far as from a percentage standpoint, I'd probably use, out of our entire program, we maybe use 5% isometric exercises to drive this. But I just think, again, it's a very cool topic and it's a misunderstood training element that couldn't be incorporated to increase the spring and avoid the ooze, right? So again, we use it in the warm-up. Why? Because there's a thermal response to it, right? We create better contractile environment. It turns or primes the nervous system on, okay? And increases speed of contraction, right? This ramping up increases enzymic activity and then increases coordination of muscle activity by the central nervous system. Again, you're getting that muscle, you're bringing more blood to that muscle and you're getting that muscle to talk to that brain at a faster rate, right? So what does that look like? Again, you know, we utilize more long duration isometrics in a warm-up with specific examples. We do plank, side plank, front plank. We do push-up holds. We do goblet squat holds. We might do split squat holds. You know, it's the beauty of it is the creativity is unmatched. I mean, because again, it's joint specific. So whatever that need for that day is, if you added in a 25-second or 30-second isometric hold to a movement that's very similar to what you're starting with, again, I think it's very beneficial or very, very beneficial. Moving on, right? So then we talk about post-action potentiation, right? So again, you know, it's the old metaphor, like you see a pail on the floor and you think it's full of water and you go to swing it and you swing and it's empty, you're going to swing it at a faster rate than if you thought it was empty or knowing it was empty going into it, right? So we're tricking our body essentially into producing more force that's required of the activity that we're experiencing, right? So again, you look at PAP, what does it do? Greater utilization of explosive muscle fibers, right? So again, activating more fast twitch fibers, allows greater force in a rapid fashion. So rate of force development increases. You look at speed of signal being sent to the muscle. So you talk about rate coding, you talk about the impulse being way stronger and way faster, right? And then the increased speed of power of contraction. So again, inside that muscle, that contraction is going to be stronger. Okay, and again, my drag racing metaphor, it's like the trans brake. If anyone's familiar with drag racing, right? A trans brake is this device that they put in to allow the car to take off at a higher RPM. So essentially, that holds reverse and it holds first gear and reverse at the same time, all right? Which allows those RPMs to rev up higher than it normally would if you just had your foot on the brake, okay? Which allows, again, for more torque generation and for more horsepower initially on the start. So why is this? How does this relate to PAP, right? So that's what we're doing. We're tricking our body into ramping up force production, and then we're allowing that body to experience something that's not an external resistance that is not as stressful as we previously thought it was. So we're going to create more force per exercise or per movement or per environment, whatever it might be, than what we thought was required. Okay, so essentially taking that governor off it. So again, that trans brake, being able to hold that first and reverse at the same time to ramp up those RPMs. Essentially, those are what PAP isometric means will do for you in your training process, right? And then what is that? You know, we look at explosive PAP yielding exercises, and one of the examples I used is a Bulgarian split squat jump with a weight release. So again, essentially, I don't have a video of it because again, we just weren't able to get a lot of these videos and things together because of the fact that we got hit with this current situation with coronavirus. But essentially, being down in that Bulgarian split squat and then holding two dumbbells and releasing the dumbbells and then driving up out of it, right? Because we get this potentiation because we're in this area, we're able to ramp up more force because of the external resistance of the dumbbells. As we release the dumbbells, our body still is experiencing and thinking that we have to create this force to overcome this. So we're going to create more force on the jump, right? Then you look at explosive PAP overcoming, which is probably the easiest way to integrate it into your program. You get an immovable object, your body is going to create as much force as humanly possible against that immovable object. Then you go ahead and you translate it to a bar or to a squat. So again, you can see right here, the demonstration, Matt Van Dyke is coming out of his book, Applied Principles of Power Development. You could see that, again, it's a pin pull. So for us, you know, this could either relate to, and because it's joint specific, you get extremely creative with it. You could turn around and do a box jump after this. You could turn around and do a clean after this. You could turn around and do a squat after this. There's a lot of application that comes involved with explosive PAP overcoming exercises. And then again, you get into the realm of like, okay, well, and it's probably one of the questions already, but you know, coach, what about yielding and overcoming? Like, aren't we experiencing both of these in a lot of our movements? And the answer is yes. So you look at your typical pause squat, you have yielding isometric strength that you're building, and you have overcoming isometric strength that you're building, right? So we stop, we hold, and then we hit that concentric. We allow our body to ramp up that force production to overcome the external resistance on our back, right? So again, you look at pause bench, pause squat, any pause lunge variation, you're gonna have that both of these components to it, okay? And then you look at long duration yielding, all right? And we've seen, you know, a lot of people have gravitated, especially when you talk about fiber types and how can we train fiber types to maximize their potential. So like a lot of muscles in the back are actually slow twitch in nature because they support postural strength throughout the day. Well, how do we train those? If you want to train them in a slow twitch manner, long duration yielding exercises, so bat wings, holds via either bent row or barbell row or pull-ups. You can be as creative as you want, but you can see the benefits of it if you're going to go and try to maximize training training stimuluses to match the fiber types that you are training. Okay, and then you look at long duration overcoming. So again, a lot of the stuff that we use here at FAU is a lot of the iron ankle series from Chris Corfus. As far as just, again, getting in that A-hole position, pushing up strong and tall, and then you could overload these long duration overcoming. But as you overload it, again, there's an inverse relationship between intensity and velocity. So as we overload it, we cut down the amount of duration of time. All right. I hope I brought some clarity to what seems to be a very complicated training component and some understanding to it. Again, the beauty of isometrics in a nutshell is that you can be joint specific, you can be creative. You don't need a ton of equipment. Again, there's a ton of people putting out great content as far as how to use these specific exercises at home with no equipment. And then again, to me, I think it's anytime that we can increase the stretch shortening cycle, the efficiency of the stretch shortening cycle, and from a mechanical standpoint, increase just the overall bodily stiffness and postural strength, I think is going to be extremely important to athletes. This is my contact information. If y'all have any questions, feel free to reach out to any of the 3 platforms I provided. And again, anybody that's watching, we appreciate it. And, again, hopefully this thing's over soon.
Coach, that was great. We'll move on to the Q&A section. So I'll steal the first spot, and I'll ask you. So you're discussing some of the training volumes of the actual isometric exercises. What would you say about athletes with a younger training age and how that actually might look in their diet of training as opposed to someone who's a little bit more advanced, like a college football player?
So anytime you have younger training ages, I think you need to start more general and you need to slow cook them. So again, I would start out with basic movements. So, maybe holding the body weight squat at 90 degrees or a split squat or, something very basic in nature. I would start long duration, right? Because their bodies are not equipped because of their training age to handle higher intensity work yet, right? We have to build those capacities up as we move through their training years, right? We just don't want to just hop into it because there is risk of injury with training modalities.
That's good. So first question here on YouTube from Elijah Blackman. He's asking, is static strength the only vital, the only vital in the touchdown stance of, the touchdown and then the liftoff phase of sprinting?
Can you say that question one more time for me?
Yeah, so that's just worded a little funny here. So is static strength the only vital part in the touchdown and then the stance phase of sprinting?
So static strength, I'm guessing he's alluding to isometric strength.
Right.
I think, again, because we're in that amortization phase, if we're not strong from an isometric standpoint, right, and we haven't developed this stiffness specifically in the Achilles ankle complex, right, that stiffness through plyometric training and through just sprinting in general, again, I think you'll be more prone to oozing out energy and leaking energy, which will lead to less force production and application as you get into that cyclical gait pattern, I think further on down as you go. So again, yeah, I think it's extremely important because the body's ability to develop tensile strength, you look at collision sports, specifically not just to running, before we hit somebody, we tense up. That's why isometric training for the neck has been so, I wouldn't call it revolutionary, but it's had such a big impact on reducing concussions because it's this ability to maintain biomechanical positions in specific situations that require, so rapid stiffening when you're getting hit, rapid stiffening of that, again, those co-contractions of that ankle when you're hitting that foot on that ground, or when that foot is making ground contact.
Great. So the next question is from Barreled Up Baseball. Is asking about a 5-day split in a training week. He's asking if you choose your isometrics for PAP for a specific region of whatever you're training that day, or do you use it as a basically like a lower CNS movement to be able to train an opposite region, the same way that you'd split an upper and a lower in the same day, or do you use it in succession? So basically like using PAP on the upper and then doing an upper body workout versus using PAP on the upper just because you're not doing upper that day.
So he's asking, do I do isometric exercises on days that I'm doing lower body, right? Do I use upper body exercises because of the high neural stress that's incorporated with it, right?
Correct.
You know, I've played around with that idea. As I move through my training calendar, we try to increase the density of our workouts. So we end up in the summertime, ended up being total body anyway. And that's kind of when we utilize a lot of these PAP, these potentiation clusters. So for us, again, trying to match stress with stress, I think in a perfect world, I would say, yes, I would do it on my high day. You know, we don't live in a perfect world. So again, I don't think there's anything wrong with getting some potentiation specifically, you know, if you're doing a bench press and you're trying to potentiate the bench press, maybe with isometric pin press or even your upper body stuff. I don't think there's anything wrong with putting it on a low day. Just understand that it's a little bit more neurally taxing. So again, when you just look at the overall accumulated fatigue of the week, incorporating that in.
All right, sounds great, Coach. Appreciate your time. Great presentation. And I guess we'll move on to the next presenter. It'll be Kyle.
Got me?
Yep, hear you, Kyle, loud and clear. You ready to go?
Yeah, I'm ready.
I'll turn it over to you.
Can y'all see that?
No, we're still on your camera.
All right.
Okay, yep, there we go.
Okay, are we good to go? Is it on the title screen?
Yep, good to go.
Okay, perfect. All right, so I'm Kyle Little. I'm the director of strength and conditioning at McNeese State. You know, I'm excited to hop on here with y'all and kind of share, you know, my thoughts on the shoulder. And kind of the way this came about was a few years ago. You know, I was having some problems with my football team with some shoulder injuries. You know, and I thought I had a good understanding of the shoulder and how we should train it. And then, you know, I started diving deeper and started listening to people that were smarter than me, such as, you know, Eric Cressy, such as Dr. Andrea Ospina, you know, and realized that I didn't know as much as I needed to know about the shoulder to give these guys what they need to be able to perform their tasks on the field. And so I just wanted to share how I dug into it, you know, the information that I found from these guys and how I apply it to my athletes to help them. So first thing I'm gonna do, I'm gonna give you an overview. I got a lot of stuff that I'm trying to talk about because it's extremely complex. But the main thing is keeping the ball in the socket. And when we think about this, you know, the hip's a ball and socket joint too, but it's different. The hip is made for stability. It's got a deeper socket, whereas the glenohumeral joint is like a golf ball on its tee. And so when we're keeping the ball in the socket, we've got to look at arthrokinematics, which is the smaller movement of that ball in the socket, rather than osteokinematics, which is your flexion, extension, horizontal abduction, all that stuff. So, you know, I'll get into a little bit more detail about that. We'll go over some important anatomy. So we'll go over points of the shoulder that are a separate structure on the body that affects how the shoulder moves. And then we'll kind of dive into achieving motion. That's kind of a term that gets thrown out there, but what does that mean? And how you can achieve it and how I go about achieving it. Training through full range of motion, that's another thing that's thrown out there all the time, what that means. And then building strength at both ends is a concept I really want to get out there. It's not my concept. You know, somebody smarter than me started talking about that. And then how I apply these principles in my program. So keeping the ball on its socket. So right now we're talking about the glenohumeral joint. Again, it's not the same as the hip joint. It's unstable compared to the hip joint, which is why it has such a big range of motion. And so, you know, if you look at the you know, the diagram, you can see all the joints like that. It's much more than we think. We can't dumb this down. It's not just rotations. It's not more, you know, more rows, you know, anything like that. got to attack this more of a complex thought process. And then, is it about the ball? Is it about the socket? Or is it about both? Because the humerus is attached to the scapula, which is in itself. So, you know, the rotator cuff, its job is to pull the ball on the socket, among some other things like external rotation, internal rotation. And then the scapula has to move the ball to make sure we keep the integrity of this glenohumeral joint. Pay attention to arthrokinematics more than osteokinematics. And what's the difference? We talked about it. When I talk about arthrokinematics, I'm talking about glide. You know, is the head of that humerus going to the front of that fossa, which is that depression that ball fits into? And that's not what we want. We want that ball to stay centered on that glenoid fossa. All right. Why is that important? We want to keep the integrity of that joint. The more movement I get, the more stress I put on that joint, the more stress I put on those anterior structures like the labrum, all these anterior ligaments. All right. And then when the cuff gets more fatigued because it's to pull that ball into that socket, we're going to get a lot more glide. So I'll talk about it, but the coach's eye is extremely important here when we dive into exercises that incorporate the shoulder, from benching to rowing to more detailed exercises such as working external rotation or working protraction and upward rotation. So the shoulder is extremely complex. So we can't do something extremely simple as full range of motion chin-ups or, you know, full vertical presses. We've got to have, like I said, we got to have a little bit more complex here. It's also extremely claustrophobic. It's got 8 major nerves running through it, the brachial plexus. All right, it's got 7 muscular attachments to the scapula. It's got 6 major blood vessels. So there's a lot of stuff going on in your shoulder. There's 4 joints to it: the glenohumeral joint, the scapulothoracic joint, the AC joint. And those are the 3 joints I really want to talk about. And then the sternoclavicular joint, where the clavicle or the collarbone attaches to the sternum. But those top 3 in red, those are the really the joints I want to focus on when we talk about shoulder health and how we're going to attack this shoulder. Other joints of importance, and it's really a long segment of joints, is your thoracic spine, your cervical spine, your lumbar spine. And we'll get into that. The reason is these downward rotators and how they attach to these spinal segments. All right, the scapulothoracic joint. The way it determines a lot of the arthrokinematics that happen at the actual glenohumeral joint. And so what I'm talking about here is how the scapula articulates around the rib cage. And that's going to be important, from protraction to retraction to upward rotation, downward rotation, posterior tilt. So the way that articulates is extremely important. And a lot of it is the way that your T-spine is shaped when we're asking your scapula to move. All right, so it's got to be able to move freely on that rib cage. And especially when we get into upward rotation and how the T-spine, you know, we should have a flex T-spine when we start to try to create that external or that upward rotation to try and give that a better surface to upward rotate. So in order to get overhead, my scapula has got to be able to protract, upwardly rotate, and posteriorly tilt to here and keep that subacromial space, which is that space between the AC joint, space between the AC joint and the actual head of the humerus, right? If I'm not getting upward rotate and posterior tilt, which is the top of my scapula backwards, you know, I'm going to run the head of that humerus up into that subacromial space. That's what we're going to try to preserve, right, a lot of these movements. All right. Now, protraction upward. This is important. One, not just for overhead athletes. This is extremely important for overhead athletes, but it's also important because a lot of us, even though, you know, maybe an O-lineman is considered a overhead athlete, we're asking them to do movements that require scapula to protract and upwardly rotate. So as the glenohumeral GH flexes the scapula, all right, it must move forward and rotate up so that ball stays on that socket as it comes up, right? The serratus anterior has to turn on, which if you look on the picture is the muscles that attach the ribs right here that pull that scapula forward and rotate up. And it's relatively weak and small to a lot of your downward rotators. So this is going to be important going forward on how we can maximally train that serratus anterior. It's not getting inhibited by its antagonist. So like I said, chronic or overactive downward rotators such as the lat, rhomboid, and then the levator is another one, which is why we incorporated the cervical spine into this. That can also prevent that serratus from doing its job to its fullest ability. And then how do we know, right? Whether or not my scapula is moving correctly? One, we've got to make sure that, is it at a deficiency already? So resting, it should be about a 35-degree upward rotation from the actual spine, right? And then as I'm fully abducted or flexed, it should move to approximately 55 degrees. Now, I get it. I have 100 people on my team that I need to work out. It's tough to evaluate everybody's scapula, but if you're asking your athlete to go and they feel tightness or they don't feel comfortable, that's a sign that we need to really look at things and see how that scapula is moving up. Because if I take my hand on those players and I physically rotate their scapula up, it starts to deviate that feeling that they're getting from that. And so that right there, know that I've got some work to do on that. Posterior tilt, Ben Kibler said, posterior tilt of the scapula is extremely important in preventing an increased shear stress on anterior stabilizing structures, the labrum, the glenohumeral. And so it's not just about upward rotation. I've got to get that scapula tilted back. Right here in the picture is that I can see that posterior tilt, this space, this subacromial space, gets this AC joint moving backwards slightly to room for my humerus to come overhead, right? And so the muscle that does that, the low trap, and that's what actually pulls, if you can see right here, LT stands for low trap. It pulls that scapula into a posterior tilt to help clear that space, right? But it's easy to compensate for. People, I see it all the time. People are on the ground doing Ys, and again, I used to cover this before I started diving deeper and started listening to people smarter than I am, is they started to compensate with T-spine. And so we asked them to do a Y, we asked them to tilt that scapula, we asked them to get their wrists up, and what do? They get a big chest, they start to extend it, overextend at the T-spine, and putting that on. Just like moving forward, just like the serratus, I've got to make sure that my antagonist isn't hypertonic, which is the pec minor. And that's what we see a lot of the time. We got these people that people say are anteriorly rotated. Well, that's an anterior tilt of the scapula, hypertonic pec minor that, I need to release. And that's going to be important when we talk about working that low trap, making sure that we take advantage of that and make sure that we ask the issue, if it is an issue, of that pec minor. All right, this is what people call the shoulder. This is the actual golf ball on the tee. And that's the reason it's the most mobile joint, is because of the bony anatomy, right? But it's normal human shoulder. Now, I'm not dumb. We're not aliens. I'm not saying that you have an alien shoulder. But back in the day, so evolution happens over thousands of years, right? So it just became sedentary in our lifestyle 100 years. So we still have a hunter-gatherer shoulder where we used to climb trees. We used to reach into these big ranges of motion, all right? Do that anymore. So if you're not working on that and you're not stimulating those mechanoreceptors at that end range of motion, mechanoreceptors, and we lose range of motion. So just because it's a mobile joint doesn't mean it's as mobile as it should be. And I can't just think of stability. I have to think of putting in adequate range of motion that I need for my athlete's shoulder. And we'll talk about the difference in athletes and what we're talking about there. But that plays into the osteokinematics we're chasing. We say we want to get to 180 degrees of flexion. I need to bench. I need to get to about 40 degree extension, all that stuff. And so how do I tell whether or not I have a shoulder? It depends on the joint when we talk about this. And a lot of this I get from Spina. And I encourage a lot of the people listening to look into FRC, the Functional Range Conditioning course. It really shed a lot of light on the subject. Internal rotation at the shoulder, that lets me know, do I have access to the shoulder that I need to? And can I internally rotate approximately 70 degrees? And the reason is that lets me know the capsule. Do I have enough space in my joint to even be able to move, right? To be able to hit these osteokinematics, to have enough space inside the capsule to be able to even do that, let alone whether I have a hypertonic lat that won't let me, flex or whatever it is. So I want to get into anatomy. I kind of want a little bit just because I got a lot more to share with you guys. And this is kind of the latissimus dorsi, your lat. It has attachments at the scapula. So it is a huge down rotator. It attaches to the humerus, attaches to the thoracic and lumbar spine. So it articulates all the way down to your lumbar spine, which is why the lumbar spine plays a significant importance in, what we're going to be doing. There's its actions, but the big actions I want to cover are scapular downward rotation, humeral extension, and lumbar extension. It is a huge core stabilizer. So I'm not saying the latissimus dorsi isn't important. It's extremely important. What I'm saying is make sure that I don't have an athlete that their lats turned on all the time. They can't have a lat enough to be able to work other muscles. So, I'm working against this muscle that's strong and it covers a huge area of my body. It's a core stabilizer just because of how large the attachments are, right? It covers my whole back. It attaches to my scapula all the way down to my lumbar spine. So it's a major transferring force from the lower body to the upper body. So I've got to make sure that I have a strong lat on that, right? But the exercise that the lat's going to inhibit is overhead movements, reaching movements. That overhead movements could be categorized into. It's going to inhibit external rotation. It's going to inhibit spinal flexion to the other side. So the lat's ability to tone down is going to affect how we get to overhead movements. And if I don't get into overhead movement with a lat that down regulates, I'm going to get more glide because I'm not going to be able to clear that subacromial space. So I get more arthrokinematics here just because my lat's inability to down regulate here. Rhomboid is another downward rotator that I want to talk about. It attaches to the scapula, it attaches to the spine. It downward rotates as well. And then the levator scapula, you can see how it attaches to the actual the scapula from the spine here. So it's a downward rotator. If I'm in cervical extension, when I say that, if we're looking forward, the spine actually moves two ways at one time. If I'm looking forward, the bottom of my spine is flexing while the top C spine is extending if I have a forward head position. If I'm looking forward, the top of my cervical spine here, if I'm getting into extension, I'm toning up that levator scapula and I'm working against it. Scapular tilt, again, the pec minor is to your anterior tilter, and your low trap is going to tilt that scapular posteriorly. To make sure we know where we're talking about, there's some pictures there. The rotator cuff, this is important. Obviously, it pulls the head of the humerus into the glenoid fossa, and so making sure that we're doing a good job of identifying, working our rotator cuffs effectively. All right, the supraspinatus. This is the most torn rotator cuff here. It's responsible for initial induction, but it's also active all the way through. And so this is a big player. It's responsible for up to 50% of total torque during abduction, even the deltoid turning on. And it's a huge deceler of the arm. And so when we talk about training the supraspinatus, if I'm not training in an eccentric fashion at some point in my program, I'm missing the boat a little bit on this one. We've got to really teach that supraspinatus to absorb force. Coach Joey talked about it in terms of isometrics. Like I want to train this eccentrically. I want to train this isometrically and teach it to absorb force here. The subscapularis on this, it's an internal rotator. It's below your scapula. It goes on your shoulder. It controls anterior glide, but it's got a lot of things helping it. The pec is an internal rotator. The lat is helping it as an internal rotator. So this is not something that I focus too much. The infraspinatus, this is going to be your external rotator. We can see where it attaches to, but it's another important arm. And so again, I'm probably at some point in my program going to train this eccentrically and isometrically. And then the teres is another external rotator. Guys, if I'm covering this too fast and you have questions at the end, please feel free. I want to make sure that we get to some other things. Other glenohumeral stabilizers that I want to mention, the long head of the bicep and tricep. I never used to do arms. I was always a complex movement guy and didn't understand, we're getting, bicep activation and chin ups and pressing. I'm getting tricep activation, but they're actually glenohumeral stabilizers. So I've incorporated a little bit more arm work into my program. And so, because we can see the long head of the tricep attaches to the scapula and ulna. So it's an elbow extensor. It's also an humeral extensor. So, and how we train that, we train triceps overhead. Alan Bishop has put some great posts about French pressing. French press would be a great exercise for this. Same with the long head of the bicep. It actually attaches to the glenoid and the radial tuberosity. It is responsible for glenohumeral flexion. So we want to put that thing into extension. So we're going to lay back on a, incline. Now, something I want to address in this is don't lay back all the, it's only a slight incline because most of your athletes probably don't have more than 30 degrees of extension. And if I'm telling my athlete to lay back more than that 30 degrees, I'm probably going to get some anterior glide because I don't have that extension. And my body is great at compensating in short term. It might not be for the good of the long-term health, but short term, your body's going to wait again. And you're going to get that anterior glide, which is not what we want. So that's not a huge. Now, achieving range of motion, extremely complicated and messy. And what I mean by that, we talked about the complexity of it, but messy. Approximately 70% of overhead athletes, have been shown to have a labral tear. Most of it is an adaptation to throwing, but the reason I want to mention this is when we're doing all these movements, if I have closing angle pain, which means say if I'm flexing overhead, if I've got pain on the superior side, the top side right here, I'm going to stay out of that range of motion. I've got something wrong there. So I'm going to try and figure out that closing angle pain. And now when we talk about full range of motion, it's individual to sports and to athletes and to body parts and to movement. And I know you're saying like, Coach, thanks for helping me out. That's a lot of shit. Sorry for cussing. It's individual to the sport. It's easier than you think. Let's take baseball and let's take football. Most football players do not need the same external rotation capabilities that baseball pitchers have because they have to lay back when they throw. They have to lay back in the external rotation so far when they throw. Your own lineman doesn't need to lay back that far. Still needs external rotation capabilities, but he doesn't need it like a baseball player. It depends on the body part as well, and it also depends on the movements you want to train. Yeah, like I said, linemen don't go overhead that much, but if I'm an Olympic, if I got a lot of Olympic movements in my program, and I'm a snatcher and I'm a jerker, and I can't get to full flexion, I've got to train flexion to 180 degrees. So it really just depends on what movements are important to your program, what athletes that you're talking about, and then what body, the osteokinematics of that body part that we're trying to work. So just for the overhead people in here, if you're a coach, we're not going to be symmetrical in terms of my right side shoulder is going to lay back to probably around 140 degrees of external rotation. I'm probably not going to get to that on my non-throwing shoulder because I'm laying back here so much. I'm just because of my sport, I'm going to have a lot more external rotation, right? but same side of my throwing shoulder, I'm going to have less internal rotation than I'm going to have on my non-throwing shoulder. So as long as those measurements on each shoulder add up to approximately 80 degrees and they're somewhat symmetrical, give or take 5 to 10 degrees, we're good to go. Okay. Moving on, a quote that I liked, just listening to Dr. Andrea Spina talk is, you can't move where you can't move. And so just because they're a jerk and they can jerk doesn't mean they're moving correctly where they're supposed to be moving correctly, because they can't move there. They don't have that motion. They can't actively get there. So, we've got to take that into consideration. We got to, when we talk about mobility, right, this big word that's been thrown around, we've got to talk internal first. We can't expect to get to full flexion and say, oh, your lat's tight, when I haven't looked internal, right? And what I mean by that is the capsular space. Do I have enough capsular space, which is a prerequisite for all these osteokinematics like flexion and stuff? Do I have enough space to be able to work into that movement, right? If I have enough space in that capsule, I can freely articulate, my bones can freely articulate around each other, right? Whereas if I don't, I'm against it, right? So I've got to have enough space to be able to work. So that's one of my prerequisites, right? So capsule is the first place we start. And when we talk about that, that's why internal rotation is important at the shoulder when we assess, okay, do you can shoulder? And each joint's different. The hip is internal rotation. The spine is, flexion. So it's different depending on what joint you're trying to work, okay? But the capsule is this dense tissue that encompasses any synovial joint. And so if there's no room to move on the inside, I'm not going to move on the outside, right? And so how do I achieve more space? Well, simply stretching internal rotation is going to help that, like the sleeper stretch, distractions, manual therapy, and then a lot of FRC principles. Like I very much enjoyed going to that seminar and got a lot out of it. Again, I recommend that you do the same if this is going to be important to you. But making sure that we create some space in there. And when I use FRC and I try to create space, I'm talking about pails and rails. And that's the way I'm going to create space, or going to create more range of motion through pails with that. Once I've given myself enough room, I'm probably going to see a lot of these mobility restrictions. I'm probably going to see a bigger increase in flexion, all these osteokinematics that we're talking about. I'm probably going to see a big once I just fix the capsule, right? So once I fix the capsule, it depends on what movements are important to you. Again, if I've got a pitcher and he's at 140 external rotation, I'm probably not going to work more range of motion than that. I'm probably work more active range of motion. So he's probably at 140, but I guarantee he's not 140 active. That's going to be passive. And so, that's probably not something I'm going to work on. I might work on another deficiency, right? The same principles apply. Once I fix my capsule, if I want to work on flexion, right? The same principles apply when I'm stretching, right? I want to stretch that. Just realize when you stretch, your muscle's not actually getting longer. Like I'm not stretching I bands and A bands, right? I'm down regulating that muscle in my nervous system to allow that muscle to reach its full range of motion. And so what I want to talk about here is PNF and long hold. These, and when I mean long hold, it's approximately 2 minutes, right? These are going to stimulate what's called sarcomerogenesis. I'm actually going to add sarcomeres, which is actually going to make my muscle. So just stretching for 25 seconds, AIS stretching, that's not going to make my muscle longer. It's going to down regulate and let me get to a range of motion that I already have, right? But these PNF stretching, that's going to stimulate actual changes in the tissue, right? So don't get me wrong, I use AIS stretching all the time. With my Olympic movements, I AIS stretch my hip flexor to make sure that I'm not getting antagonist inhibition in my glutes, because my extensors, that's what's important on a clean on my pull, right? So don't get me wrong, there's a place for AIS stretching. I don't want to say that, but if we're looking to change tissue, right? The AIS stretching or short-term stretching or whatever it is not going to do the trick. I've got a long hold. I've got to stimulate that sarcomerogenesis. Manual therapy is going to help me achieve a range of motion, just because force is the the language of cells. It's going to help me down regulate that muscle. But again, this is where FRC comes in. It's extremely important to me. That's where I use my pails and rails. That's where I stimulate that sarcomerogenesis. I'm actually getting longer, and I'm reaching a new range of motion. Training through a full range of motion. I don't think I've met a strength coach that says training through a full range of motion is stupid, but people still don't do it because they can't, right? They compensate. So they don't move through the full range of motion. They find a way outside of that joint and another body part to compensate to make it look like they've achieved full range of motion. So to train full motion, I know it seems kind of stupid to say, but the range of motion is required first, right? So making sure that we're getting that. So modify, guys. And I'm not the guy that says no overhead lifting. Like you can't do that. You don't have overhead, you don't have full flexion. I'm not one of those guys. I don't like those guys. But to me, it's the same as using a slant board. If I see my athletes doing a front squat, he doesn't have enough range of motion at his ankles. You know, I'm not going to say continue to do a front squat. You know what I'm saying? I'm going to put a slant board under him. We're gonna hit good angles and good positions. Work on that range of motion, and then once I feel like he's got the range of motion required, then I'll do it. So if I'm seeing a person, you know, that can't get a full overhead motion, I'm not going to catch a snatch. I'm not going to do a standing overhead press. I'm going to put them slightly to just make sure we preserve that subacromial space, and then I'm not getting that anterior because I'm forcing flexion, and that's how my body is going to compensate. So I'm not forcing arthrokinematics, right? So just keep that in mind. Now, the way, you know, I'm not having seniors digress and stuff like that because, you know, of my planning, right? I'm going to make sure when my freshmen come in and I'm doing, you know, whatever you call, I've been places where it's called the LEAP program, whatever it is, when your freshmen come in during the summer, right? That's got to be some hit. These movements are important. It's important to get full flexion. That's what I'm going to work on with these guys while I teach them how to pull, and I'm not catching that lift yet. I'm going to teach them, okay, I'm going to teach them the pull, which is extremely complex, right? And extremely technical. And then while I'm doing that, I'm preparing their body to be in a good overhead position. So I'm not saying I'm limiting guys when they, you know, are juniors, sophomores, seniors, whatever it is. So I have a plan about this. Now we've got to work passive to active range of motion. Now, once I've achieved range of motion, I don't have it actively yet. I've got to be able to train into that passive range of motion, because the more passive range of motion that I acquire without, you know, making it usable or becoming active, the more room for error your athlete is, because weakness is in a position is the biggest detriment to health, right? If I'm weak in a position, I get put into a position that I'm weak in, and somebody applies enough force, something's going to go wrong in that position, right? So the way we do that is we both ends. So when your muscle is weakest, shortest, and longest part of the muscle. So my terrible graph here, I know it looks like a kindergarten, all right? But if you can see, 0 is my shortest, and I'm getting over to my longest here, right? So this, I'm not going to be able to produce. So I'm going to work on the short range of motion, the end range of motion here. I'm going to range of motion here, and the passive range of motion, because a lot of this is going to be passive right here. A lot of that's going to be passive. All right. So you're always going to regret not training the position you get hurt in. That's played big in my head when I'm thinking all this. So, all right, if I want to talk about this graph a little bit more, if we increase range of motion, so we take the range of motion, say it's here, right, and we move it out here, and then we work on the places I'm weakest, so we work on the long range of motion, right, and we work on the shortest range of motion, this graph's going to change, right? So now, right, my range of motion's increased, my force that I can produce in that shortest and longest range of motion increase, and I get a more desirable kindergartner drawing here, right? And so when we talk about training the passive range of motions, which is going to be right about here and right about here, your long and short, right? You can't concentrically train passive range of motion. That's why it's passive range of motion. You can't get into it, right? So you got to teach your nervous systems about these ranges of motion. And how we do that is isometrics and quasi-isometric, or eccentric quasi-isometrics, or EQIs. And what I mean by that is right? It's a passive range hold. So I take myself into passive with an external object, or a partner brings me to passive, right? And then I irradiate, and then I try to hold that passive range of motion isometric. Obviously, I'm not going to be able to hold it long because it's, you know, something I'm not used to. It's going to feel like I'm cramping. I'm going to say, oh crap, right? I'm not used to this. But as the eccentric quasi-isometrics come into play, right, is when I start to fatigue at that passive range of motion, I'm going to drop, arm drop. I'm going to fail with good technique. And that's that eccentric quasi-isometric. And the eccentric plays because that's another stimulant of that sarcomerigenesis that we talked about. So those are two things. Again, you can't concentrically move into passive range of motion. You've got to move yourself there with an external object, and then train your nervous systems and teach them about that range of motion. All right, coach's eye. I can't that's enough. The big thing is making sure that, you know, we're looking at these. Is my athlete compensating because, one, the weight's too high for smaller muscle, have the range of motion. You know, that is extremely important when we're working the shoulder, just because of the type of joint it is. It could be, and saying that, throwing exercises in, okay, I got external rotation here. I got some scat push-ups here. You know, that thing's off the list. So when it comes to the shoulder, how you do things matters a lot more than what you're doing. Right? The more complex I get, the more room for error at the shoulder that I have. So Coach Joey said is, you know, complex or simple when he moves the complex. Same thing here with this. Just making sure that our eye, like, we're coaching the head. If we're not, we're doing something wrong. We need to ask our athletes where they feel this, because that'll, if I can't see small, I can't see small glide, which is, again, that head moving on that fossa, right? If the athlete's not feeling it where they should, it's not happening, right? So I need to ask my athlete, hey, do you feel this? Where do you feel this? Are you feeling it in the right spot? Because, again, a rotator cuff fatigue, the thing that holds that ball in the socket, equals more glide. So because of that, I'm going to get a lot more quality than I'm going to get quantity, right? And that's my goal is, you know, because a lot of people go to these red bands. I'm talking elite FTS bands, going to these higher bands. I guarantee you, if we took that same athlete and we put him on a lighter band or a lighter weight, and I really focused on arthrokinematics and how that athlete, I'm gonna get him burning where he should have felt that. So, so specific considerations for these movements. So external rotation from an abducted standpoint, or the elbow by your side. Easy to compensate. There's a lot of movements your athletes can do to make it look like they're getting this accomplished extension. Again, if I externally rotate and my elbow moves back and I'm getting extension, look at the elbow. Or if I'm abducting here, look at the elbow. If I'm getting anterior glide and I'm going here, right? So a lot of things to watch at. Now, we put the towel below the between the elbow and side. This isn't just as a coaching cue, like, hey, don't drop the towel. That's a good cue. Like, it's a good, it's good for our athletes, but that towel gets me to about 30-degree angle, right? And that allows for better activation of those external rotators. So just put a towel in between their arm, whether I'm side lying or I'm standing or whatever. It's a good, external cue for these athletes, but it's also going to allow me to better activate my rotator cuff, right? My external rotators. And you should feel this on the posterior, your backside of your shoulder. You should feel this where those rotator cuff muscles are. External rotation from an abducted. This is easier to compensate than the adducted. I would say start with a support. In front, where you're sitting down and your elbow's on top of your knee. You can use a barbell. I would start, and when we're cueing our athletes, I always tell my athletes, there's a steel pipe running through your elbow into your shoulder. So there's no movement there, right? So you can rotate on that steel pipe, but you're not moving forward, back, up, down, right? And then external rotation stretch, right? When we talk about full range of motion, right? So we want to hit full range of motion, right? But when I come down into internal rotation, I want to make sure, look for those arthrokinematics. Am I anteriorly tilting? Am I getting some anterior glide here? So things to look for. And I want to work range of motion, both abducted and adducted. That makes the band a poor option for large range of motion work. And the reason why is, right, I'm in external rotation. I'm weakest at my shortest position, well, the band's strongest at that position. So I'm not going to be able to get in a good position through full range of motion with the band. So that's why I like to use my full range of motion work. I like to use free weights to make sure that I'm not increasing weight where I don't want to. Horizontal pulls. This is one of the most poorly I see, because we're just looking for weight. We're looking to pull that dumbbell or bar up to us. This is another one that we need to work on. Scapular control. So I see poor scapular control. I see people stay in a locked scapular position instead of letting it move freely. I see arms, which is going to lead to that anterior glide. All right, so mechanics that we're going to look for in rows, like rows, cable row, dumbbell row, whatever it is row the weight back, right? I want to see a natural arcing from the side, right? If I pull straight up, I'm probably going to dump that shoulder forward. So I want to go, as my shoulder blade moves, I want to roll that dumbbell or that weight back, right? I should see the elbow move with the shoulder, right? I tell my athletes that to think about shoulder blades and your shoulder, your arms are just a byproduct, right? So I'm making sure that I'm not becoming arm dominant. I'm not just really trying to rip that thing up with my bicep, all right? And just like your external rotations, I want to bring my elbow a little bit out to 30 degrees to allow for activation of that rotator cuff. And because of that, it's going to pull my humerus into that fossa, right? And I'm going to get less anterior glide because my rotator cuff's allowed to activate a little bit, right? I shouldn't see a jerking motion, because what happens when people get heavyweight, they jerk and then all of a sudden to a poor scapular position or anterior glide. And again, I should feel this lats in my upper back, not my arms. If we feel in our arms more than our back, we have a problem, right? Horizontal pushes. It depends on whether I categorize them in a reaching or a pressing exercise. And what I mean by that is my scapula locked down or is it free moving, right? Exercises, just make sure you got good shoulder blade movement. This could be a landmine press, right? This could be head pressing, right? If I'm overhead pressing, I got full flexion, I'm going to see some good shoulder blade movement because it has to rotate up to achieve the position I want to look into, or I want to get into, right? The weight should not force into thoracic, lumbar, or cervical extension. Again, the point of this when I reach is to get good upward rotation, right? If I'm extended at the cervical spine, that levator's toned up, right? Extending at the lumbar spine, I'm putting stress on my lumbar spine, which is universal, like, right? But it's also toning up my lat because it articulates down to my lower back. And then my thoracic, right? I shouldn't extend there. I should have a natural spine so my shoulder blade has a good surface to glide upon. And then pressing exercises like bench press, we need to make sure that we have extension first, right? Because I need extension to be able to bring that that bar all the way to my chest, right? And so if I don't have extension, how's my body going to compensate for that? Get kinematics here, right? I'm gonna glide forward, and a lot of your athletes will say, "I'm like, I got some pain at the front of my shoulder." If you took that person back and asked them to get actively into extension, he probably doesn't have the amount of extension needed to bring that bar down to his chest, right? The scapula is set up at the tilt here, right? I've got slight spinal extension, and boys are packed down and back. And the reason for that is, right, we talked about our lat. We talked about I needed to tone down movement, but I needed to tone up for these pressing movements like a bench press because it's a stabilizer, right? It's a downward rotator attached to my humerus, a huge stabilizer. So at my spine allows these lats to turn on a little bit more. And then just like I talked about with horizontal pulls that forward, again, just to make sure I've got good shoulder osteoconnected. Specific considerations for vertical pull. The biggest thing I don't see is full range of motion. The reason we want that, the scapula is starting to be pulled into upward rotation. So we want to train that upward rotation, and we can do that eccentrically, right? Into flexion. We can eccentrically train it into upward rotation. And what are we doing? We're stimulating neurogenesis. We're increasing length of that muscle, right? And so we're getting the things that we want out of it. So just make sure that we're training through full range of motion. If you have an athlete that can't do it, put a band on them, whatever it means that you want to do, get them on a lat pull down machine. I don't know how you want to modify that. Make sure you're hitting full range of motion, and then on the way up as well, making sure I get my hands by my collarbone, and I'm not doing this, right? Again, I have to be able to get to full 180 degrees of flexion. If I'm going to do standing rest where there's no decline at all, I'm straight up and down, I'm full vertical, right? Again, I need capsular space, I need flexion capabilities, I need to have a serratus activate. My lower trap has to be able to activate, and I have to have the ability to tone down downward rotators. So considerations, once all this is accomplished, make sure we're not spinal extension, right? So making sure that, one, my lower back, arching, because that tones up my lats, and, I want to be able to upward rotate, my cervical spine. I'm not toning up my levators. Considerations that we've already talked about that I want to remind you about. So specific considerations for some important muscles that we're talking about, which is, making sure our scap is able to move well, right? Serratus anterior. Before I do any serratus anterior work, I make sure I get some manual therapy on my antagonist, just to make sure that I down regulate them. So I'll roll out my lats, my levator, and I've used kettlebells on the pec minor, the rhomboid and the lats, or however you want to do that. But I like to tone down those just to make sure that I'm getting as much out of my serratus anterior. Again, you've got to feel it. It attaches to those ribs. So the way I talk about it, right below my armpit is where I should feel it, and my athletes, how they're feeling it, and that lets me know, right? Start ground-based up that help them feel that movement and help them turn it on. I've got to get above 90 degrees of flexion, because once above 90 degrees of flexion, then I'm requiring my serratus to turn on to allow me to get above 90 degrees of flexion. So even when I'm doing a scat push-up around, just flat scat push-up, I'm gonna get my hands out in front of my shoulders to get that, right? Again, I'm gonna limit cervical extension, I'm gonna down regulate the levator. I'm gonna limit my anterior pelvic tilt to make sure I'm not toning up my lats. I'm gonna create a flex T-spine. Again, I'm gonna ask them to round that back, so I give them the scapula a good surface to rotate around. So anytime I do serratus work, I tell them I want to round it back. I want you to get hunchbacked on me, all right? And we're not gonna look like a hunchback on an overhead press. I get that, but I'm trying to turn these on as much as I can, right? And then I can get unilateral and drive a little bit of rotation. So I'm on the side and I do a unilateral and I drive that rotation. I'm going to get that rotating up a little bit harder too. My low trap, again, manual therapy on my inside. A lot of kettlebells on this, so just having them lay on their back. They can do it with a barbell. Like you can find a way, get creative to start to get some manual liners, so it's a lot easier for my low trap to turn on. Again, this is easy to compensate with your T-spine, right? So we shouldn't have a big chest cue here, right? And I want to reach and lift, right? My scapula is going to rotate up slightly, right? And then I'm going to lift, right? And I want those fibers, if you can see in this picture right here, run at about 135-degree angle from my spine. That's what my arm's at. So that's why we do Ys, is to run with that same fiber location as we see in this muscle right here. My progression for my serratus anterior, again, I start on the ground. A lot of this, I got a lot of Eric Cressy videos. Again, I learned from smarter people. You can go and watch his videos on these and these all fours belly lift. Again, making sure my front of my shoulder with the alternating lift off, I'm getting that rotation, right? I'm getting a little bit more activation of that serratus. Scat push-ups. Remember that we want to make sure that we walk our hands in front of us a little bit. Right? And then push-ups is basically where I do a push-up into a pike, where I throw my butt back, I push the ground forward, and get some rotation there. FOB just means on a bench, foot on bench. I in my programming. Bear crawling, especially reverse bear crawling, because I have that ground forward and up, right? And when I bear crawl, I should be the whole time I'm doing a bear crawl. I want to be protracted with my scapula to make sure I've got good stabilization, right? And I want my butt a little bit above my shoulders. Again, let's be above 90 degrees of flexion, right? Wall slides with a roller, as you can see, I get down and I get up a little bit more, and then I get into more complex movements as I progress, right? So how do I apply these principles? The team I'm coaching, what period of the off season, and basically your head coach. Like, I'm a head coach. I train softball as well as football. I've got an awesome softball head coach. He reads a lot into strength and conditioning literature. So I personally like block for softball, not because they run long distances. I obviously know that from a recovery standpoint. And Cal Dietz has a really good lecture on this if you're looking to that, as triphasic aerobic block. But during that's my first 2 weeks of my cycle. My prerequisites needed, right? Obviously aerobic capacity, it's an aerobic block. I'm in range of motion because, I'm not doing an hour and a half of aerobic stuff. That leaves a lot open for me, right? I'm expanding the range of motion, whether it's the capsule, external, whatever I need. Extension for my softball pitchers, they're coming back here. So I work extension with softball pitchers a lot. I work on being able to scapula upward rotate and posterior tilt and teach them those movements and foot strength. So that's just a basic overview of stuff I work on in that first 2 weeks with softball. Now, football, aerobic block, no. I come in and like, why aren't we moving freaking weight? So it just depends on your sport coach, what sport you're with. Where I do this, I obviously expanding range of motion where I need to early off season. And then as I progress, I start working those passive range of motions with strength, isometrics, EQIs, right? And so, but a lot of the expanding of range of motion is done when they first get here. My LEAP program, my freshmen, I expand that range of motion, and I use CARS, or controlled articular rotation, which is another principle inside the FRC, to make sure that I maintain that range of motion. Because you have mechanoreceptors all along your shoulder that with your brain, how your shoulder is moving. It's for any joint. And that's why if we don't use it, we kind of lose it. Saying is I start to lose those mechanoreceptors, right? So with the football team, principles to maintain motion I use from the FRC, the CARS I use to maintain. I've done this. I made the mistake. Don't YouTube CARS or Pails and Rails and throw them in. I highly recommend you go to the FRC course and learn exactly what these are, the nuances inside of them, and that'll give you a way better idea to program these inside your program. I use the CARS as a warm-up and during lifts as complex work. They don't fatigue the actual system too much. So I use them as a warm-up, and I use them to get ready for some shoulder work as a complex before that actual exercise, right? Pails I use to expand range of motion. I use these on non-lift days. So extra work to do, saddle up Saturdays is what we call, Saturday voluntary work. Saddle up, right? And then we also give them homework too. And so we understand that some people might not be in a position to give them homework. You don't trust your guys to be able to do it. Obviously, it's an individual based on give them homework or not. But once we started doing CARS regularly, our guys started feeling really good and started realizing, how much better that these principles of FRC are making them do. And so they start to invest in it. And obviously, how coaching is going to tell your athletes if they should be invested in it or not. If I'm not coaching it hard, they obviously important to me, and it's not going to be important to them, right? So when I strengthen, if it's in a complex, it's never paired with an upper body movement, because I'm a complex like cleans with a hip flexor release or AIS stretching or whatever. So I pair exercises, right? I never pair it with an upper body movement just because I don't want to fatigue the rotator cuff or whatever it is. I don't want to fatigue that right before I have to do a complex movement that requires that. So just keep that in mind. I make release my antagonist during the warm up or the lift. My passive range of motion training, my PRHs, my passive range liftoffs. I'll train that once or twice per week. It ends like PRHs, passive range holds, where somebody takes me into a hold, or I use an object to take me into the passive range and I hold it. I can do that on because sometimes it requires a partner. So that's part of my non-lift days a lot of time. PRLOs, liftoffs, it doesn't require a partner. And so I can do it inside. Again, this is taxing stuff. Like if you're doing pails and rails, you're doing PRHs, you're doing PRLOs, it's extremely taxing. So again, this is never even close to the front end of my workout, right? Or session. It's always going to be on the back end to make sure I'm not fatiguing something that I really need for an important main. And then full range of motion training, right, is where I work through a full range of motion. Again, my rotator, I'm working eccentrically, I'm working concentrically. I'll put that inside my workout of flex. And if I don't have it in workout on a specific day, it'll probably be somewhere in my warm up just to get it activated, just to get blood flowing to it, just to turn it on a little bit, right? Rather than fatigue it. And my serratus anteriors, I do movements for the serratus anterior before overhead movement, and that scapula, getting rotation up. And the same thing I do it for the low trap as well. So how I plan where these exercises go, this is just an example. Use any progressions in this. I just plugged in exercises, right? So there's days I want to fatigue it, right? I really want to train the serratus. Other days, like I'll do overhead day, right? If I'm not fatiguing that on a day, it's going to be my warm up to activate it. So, right, Monday or day one is a non-overhead day. I put ball slides towards the end of my training, so I'm going to actually get some more sets in rather than just maybe a set of 8 or something to turn it on, right? And then every other day, especially on my overhead days, right, I'm gonna get it in my warm up to get that serratus, so get blood flow to it, to make sure I'm turning it on, right? I'm gonna get that work. And when I do this, I also keep in mind important movements of that day inside the warm up. Like, okay, I've got a bench day. Well, I'm gonna do some adducted, sideline external rotations in my warm up just to make sure my stabilizers are ready to go for that heavy bench press, right? Because it's the whole humerus in that glenoid fossa. So, my bench day, I'm in my warm up, I'm getting sideline external rotations, right? And so I'll have one day for each of these where I'm fatiguing it, right? I'm actually training it. And then the other days I'll have as a, warm up, get it going a little bit, get some blood flow there. All right. And again, these aren't micro progressions. These are just random things thrown in there. So if you have any questions, I don't know if I went over in time, to be honest with you. I'm on. I'm not sure if I went over in time, if I have availability to do any questions and answers. But if you do have questions, I'm more than willing to answer them. Use my email, Twitter, Instagram.
No, absolutely. You have a couple questions. You're doing fine. So I'll just jump straight into it. The first question we have up is from Zach. He's asking if you've ever run into a lifelong overhead athlete who may have developed some structural changes to their glenohumeral joint, and they weren't able to reach range of motion goals that you set out at the initial onset.
I wish that question was a little bit more specific in terms of what he's actually talking about. But let's just say rotation. I had a softball athlete that came in and she shot with the ball. Got no external rotation. She didn't have external rotation because she never worked on it. So she had a lot of issues with her elbow. And so, really, unless you have a labral tear, something structurally wrong, you should be able to get them into the range of motions that you desire if you're making sure that you're using effective means. Again, short-term stretching 40 minutes to do it, because you don't lengthen the muscle. Your A bands and your I bands and your sarcomere don't pull apart and stretch, right? You just tone down that muscle. And so in order to actually build length, you create sarcomerogenesis through long holds of 2 minutes or more, through eccentrics. Again, I would look into, for that person, I would look into FRC, and I think Halo Rails could really help that athlete. Again, if you have closing angle pain, right? I'm coming here and I have pain in the back of my shoulder or whatever it is, you probably need to get that checked out because you might have something going on. But unless they have a labral tear or some bony anatomy that that's preventing it, they should be able to get to those range of motions that they want. Again, I could answer a little bit more specifically if they gave me more information, but.
That was good stuff. Moving on. So Elijah asked, is poor internal and external rotation a determinant of poor thoracic mobility?
No. I think it goes the other way. I think, if I've got poor thoracic mobility, realize you're not going to get a lot of thoracic mobility because what's attached to this, right? And ribs connect at the front. So, there's not this huge range of motion that can acquire at the thoracic spine. Now, yes, we need it to move, right? But when you see huge ranges of motion in the thoracic spine, you're going to see it more at the thoracolumbar joint, right? Where the thoracic spine meets the lumbar. That's where you're going to see it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that, I do some manual work on, my flexors of my spine, some deep muscles in my spine. I'm going to do some manual work. Halo Rails works on the spine too. And so I don't think external rotation, internal rotation have an effect on the thoracic spine. No.
Cool. Next question is coming from Matt. He's asking, so is the need focused on eccentric training in regard to shorter range of motion? And then do you focus more on compound movements? And he kind of clarifies and specifies, wouldn't those compound movements still activate the fibers and improve range of motion?
I mean, it depends. Like, rotator cuff's always turned on. Like, there's a myth out there where, like, if you go over 5 pound head, you're not turning on your rotator cuff, your shoulder would dislocate. You know what I'm saying? If my rotator cuff is holds my humerus into my glenoid, I'm going to dislocate that if my rotator cuff's not turned on during these complex movements. So if I'm doing eccentrics, I'm going to get some eccentric qualities out of that in my rotator cuff, even if I'm doing eccentric. I do eccentric. I really like a lot of the stuff that Cal Dietz puts out, and I use them in a full range of motion because that's what I really want. I want to work eccentrics at the short and long range of motion. So when I do, I'll do eccentric chin-ups. I do it for bench press as well. I do it for basically everything, even external rotation, and so I do it for everything. But, obviously you're going to get a lot more bang out of your buck for complex movements as well.
Good stuff. So asking Sean's here, question he had was, what are some of the key differences you see between some of your throwing athletes? Because you mentioned having coached softball, some of the differences you've seen between softball and baseball and their shoulders.
And the shoulders, well, a lot of it is difference in pitches. My position players, they're still, the mechanics should remain very similar. I mean, you have your ball, but the mechanics should remain very similar. Whereas pitchers in baseball have a lot more demand on external rotation than a softball pitcher was, just because of their windup, right? And so for my pitchers, I focus a lot in softball. I focus a lot more on extension because they have to get behind their body. I focus on a lot of extension. I focus on horizontal abduction because, I have to get here to be able to throw the ball. Right? And so, I focus on a lot of that with my soft pitchers, and we work a lot of external rotation, passive range control. I want to make sure that, they can control those huge range of motions that they're laying back to with a baseball pitcher. So, external rotation, passive range holds are critical to keeping a lot of those guys' shoulders and elbows healthy. And it's just making sure that I don't have a huge amount of passive and a small amount of active at range of motion. So those are the big differences that I see mainly with between baseball and softball.
That's good stuff. Last one, I had you mentioned a couple times some of the different things you look for with protraction, at the beginning and the end. My question specifically is about some in football. Some of those guys that we see have a serious posterior pelvic tilt. They tend to be bound up in their T-spine and around their shoulder. What are some of the best exercises, or at least like ways you can progress them to kind of relax? Is it a problem with their trap activation, or is it just the entire posterior chain around the shoulder that I really need to be focusing on?
If you're having, are you saying you're having a problem with them getting to upward rotation, or are you saying like posturally, like are they anteriorly tilted?
Yeah, they
they
both tend to be anteriorly tilted in their pelvis as well as in around their posterior chain around their shoulder. So some of their scaps, they tend to be really locked up. They always get their chest bowed out as well.
Okay.
Just looking for some ways to kind of gear them towards relaxing a little bit and having a little bit better posture.
Absolutely. If they're anteriorly tilted, you want to do some manual release on that pec minor and really try to hammer that low trap home. Again, you've got to be really careful with the orthokinematics of that low trap work, and make sure you're progressing. It's because that low trap could be very weak in some of these athletes. And so making sure I do that, making sure that I'm able to tone down that lat. And there's a lot of really good exercises that really include breathing, because breathing can be an extremely important thing in toning down those lats. And so Eric Cressy has a lot of great stuff like a TRX squat, where that TRX point deflection. Obviously, if he's in squatted, he's not going to be too anteriorly tilted, and working on getting in that position to get that to tone down. Because obviously the lat articulates down to that lumbar spine. So I mean that could be a problem, as well as tight hip flexors can be causing that anterior tilt. So for the pelvis, there's a lot of things we need to look at, core strength, whatever. With the shoulders, again, I just go back to this of just making sure you're hammering home the ability to posteriorly tilt and the ability to upwardly rotate and protract, making sure that the antagonists to those movements aren't the muscles that need to create those movements.
Sounds good. Appreciate it, Coach.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm going to turn it over right here. Just going to roll right into mine. All right, apologies if there's any technical difficulties on my end. Just going to roll right into it. All right, so talking about metabolic considerations for position-specific conditioning. Excuse me, just one moment. All right, good. Okay, again, so metabolic considerations for position-specific conditioning. Today I'm going to be talking in the reference of college football, and specifically using some examples that we've had and used in the past couple of months here in the off season. So some of the people that I've borrowed from Again, I'm not reinventing anything. I'm definitely not smart enough to be able to say this is some sort of new revolutionary idea that I'm presenting here to y'all. But the people that are listed here have either given me the opportunity to grow as a coach or have given me some sort of piece of information. I don't want to butcher anybody's name, so I'm not gonna try. But again, thanks to everybody who's gotten me here, as well as all the information provided that allowed me to create this presentation. Right. So again, borrowing from people. To quote my good friend TK, professional baseball coach, strength and conditioning baseball coach, everything's metabolic. So from when we enter the weight room to when we go out on the field to practice, the recovery, everything's metabolic and it should be treated as such. If you're constantly considering some of the energy systems that your players need to be able to recover from a day-to-day basis, you should have a good grip on what you need to do as a strength coach. So what matters most? So there should be a deliberate division in sport, especially in team sport. Now, position-specific stuff, you kind of look at a comparison. I got some slides here, some animations here. No one wants to see two dump trucks go down the drag strip and race each other. And likewise, no one wants to see a race car try to haul something, A dump truck ain't going 150 miles an hour on a drag strip, and Corvette ain't pulling 10,000 pounds. So it's our job as strength coaches to take lemons, make lemonade out of it. So the coaches understand what they're looking for. At the end of the day, that's why they get paid the big bucks. We're taking effectively a race car and trying not to break it, right? So all 5 fingers aren't equal. They're still part of a hand. You need all of them to be able to grip something, but they need to be treated differently. Thumb ain't same as a pinky, ain't same as an index, so on and so forth. So there need to be definitive means to measure whatever you're actually prescribing within your programming. So when we look at metabolic considerations, you have to be able to say, how does this relate from one exercise to another or one modality to another? And the same goes whenever you periodize out your entire season. From a 1,000-foot view, one thing needs to be able to relate to the other. Otherwise, you're just kind of spitballing and you have no rhyme or reason to your programming. Looking into some of the specifics of football, the athlete's correlation and relation in distance to the ball is going to directly impact their time under tension and some of the other KPI that we look at. So time under tension, as well as foot contact times, and then total distance covered. Some other things we'll discuss later on. These are the things that need to be looked at and considered whenever you're looking at division of training and conditioning within your programming. Again, if you look at a football practice, there's 7 practices happening at the same time. There's head coaches, there's coordinators, and there's assistants, and there's a whole tree, an army of coaches to match a practice in and of itself. There's no reason why a one-size-fits-all program would make any type of sense. Beyond the different divisions of labor within a football team, there's different energy demands and systems of an individual athlete. So the way that I've been taught and what I've been brought up to believe is that there should be some sort of hierarchy in the way that you train and take into consideration what's important in your program. So first and foremost, I've been taught acute to chronic and also short to long and accumulation of volume. So I look at both what we do in the weight room as well as what we do on the field in terms of conditioning, those practice, and then eventually games, and the entire model of what we need to take into account for, right? Guys can't come in 3 days a week and go up 95% on squat. They're simply just going to get run into the ground. So likewise with the actual modalities of your training and then intensities, you need to be able to look at the tapering. So as we go towards the season, training needs to change, not necessarily in complexity and introduction of exercises, but things need to build off of each other and become appropriate to what's actually being demanded of the athlete. Excuse me. Right. So then looking at the actual management, I like to steal what Cody said. He was, we're basically stress managers, right? Body's an incredibly complex organism, is going to learn to adapt to whatever we throw at it. right? So we're basically like the conductor of conductor of a symphony, and we're learning all the different intricacies and bits and pieces of what needs to happen in what order. So whether a kid's going out and Joey said in his other presentation, we may expect the beginning of the week that an athlete's going to come in and perform at their best because they've had 2 days off, but we might have to consider some of the off-field things that we can't necessarily control. All these things coming together on top of our training, and they have to be considered as well. And then from athlete to athlete, you have to be able to consider what's happening within that specific group. Because again, at the end of the day, we're trying to produce a product. So a coach may have an assumption, a position coach may have an assumption about what a player may be able to do. But we have to, as strength coaches, explain to them why their strengths and weaknesses may play to one thing or another. Now, again, we have to train to try to strengthen some of those things, but we can't strengthen everything, right? Jack of all trades is the master of none. And what's Joey's is, I have it written down here. Chasing 2 rabbits, you catch no rabbits, or something like that. So training adaptations made in the field have an effect in the weight room, and the inverse is true as well. So like I said, we have to consider the holistic picture, right? We can't just say going out there and being the most explosive athlete every single day, day in and day out, is going to be the best result in effect. One athlete may have some of those explosive properties and tendencies, as well as a higher training age than another athlete, even within the same position group, let alone across the entire field, wide spectrum of football players. I mean, if you look at, Tyron Smith or Tyreek Hill, 2 of the athletes I have up here, they're both easily considered crazy freak, explosive athletes, but within their own respective, they have entirely different modalities in how they play and interact on the field. Some of the proprioceptive things come into play, but likewise, what they do on the field is entirely different, right? Tyron Hill's not going to go out and hit 23 miles an hour game after game, week after week. The same can be said about him going around and pulling on a truck play versus Tyreek Hill may go up and have to throw a stock block every now and again, or chase down a pick and tackle a guy before he scores a touchdown. So what we have to do as strength coaches is then consider some of the validity of what we use in our KPI and system and training to then include it and be able to monitor it throughout the training period. So in addition to some of the things that I'm actually talking about, and again, I don't want to step too far out of my wheelhouse here, talking about the metabolic side of things, but some of the reading that I've gone through with, Joel Jamieson, he discussed some of the congruent improvements and adaptations, CNS and neuromuscular adaptations that occur alongside with improved metabolic training. So you have to be able to, as a coach, differentiate between whether or not an athlete is posturally failing or is fatigued and is failing because of their training and their actual accumulation of volume and load, right? Moving forward. All right. So going back to everyone's CSCS, back to the textbook. So everyone understands the money system, phosphagen, that fast, immediate energy, things that we use to be explosive athletes, right? The general assumption of we have that 10-second window and then all of a sudden it just runs out is kind of the accepted consensus, or the I'm forgetting the word, the consensus on phosphagen system. And then everything after that turns into glycolytic, and then hopefully, as football players, no one falls into the oxidative. We're not marathon runners. Everyone kind of assumes that aerobic capacities, aerobic capacities aren't necessarily a high focus in football, no matter how you divide your position groups. looking into Ben Peterson's discussions and some of the seminars he's given, presentations, I've grown to see some of the synergistic components of all the energy systems working in conjunction together. Excuse me. Right. So accumulation of volume. So this is the mother lode and the nut of the presentation is that, again, with accumulation of volume and increasing of intensity, all depends upon how you as a strength coach individually decide what's most important. Now, there's different knobs to turn and different sliders to mess with on what you might decide from week to week and mesocycle to microcycle is most important. But looking at it from 1,000-foot view is still the most important. So again, taking some of the things that I gleaned from Joel Jameson. He was discussing some of the repeat energy cycles. Repeat effort energy systems. Goodness. And some of the thresholds and relativity to max aerobic speed. So some of the tests that they use in his studies that he actually observed aren't necessarily applicable, and I'll get into that later and how we actually might be able to test this in football and team sport in general. But some of his findings were that 75 to 85% of MAS and threshold tends to be the most effective for continual development of the aerobic system. And then conversely, building of that aerobic capacity gives the athlete the ability to recover quicker, further phosphagen in their ATP system. Furthering from that, he just started to discuss interval training in relativity to MAS, and found that whenever they were, so interval training in relativity to MAS, whenever it is above 90%, with appropriate rest times in relativity to whatever their sport demand is, whether it's soccer, but again, in this case, football, what's the magic number? 4 to 6 seconds for every play. The idea is that it needs to mirror what the actual demands of the game are going to be. Likewise, again, it needs to taper from general to specific. So some of the things that he discusses may be irrelevant to whatever the sport is, but again, you as a strength coach have to decide what's most pertinent at the moment and where are we at in our phase of training. So initially, the base of the initial base and accumulation of volume is most pertinent. And then as we approach competition and then continual execution of competition, as we see in football, they have to be able to survive, basically. At the end of the day, what we're training them for is practice, right? If they're going to get killed in practice, they're not going to be able to perform in the games. Moving forward. So, again, going back to school, the NSCA's definition of the main energy provider for high capacity and power movements is the phosphagen system. So, again, backtracking to what Dr. Peterson has said in the past in some of his explanations of how this interacts synergistically with the other energy systems, is that it is definitely the first, obviously the first line energy and substrate. And then after about 3 minutes, you start to see exhaustion. But the way that we train it doesn't necessarily have to be entirely focused on it. Some of the models from Al Vermeil discussion of how we start branching off in relativity to the sport plays exactly into how we train these energy systems. So the repeat spinability is kind of, the energy convergence of what we see. This is something, again, I nicked from Ben Peterson in one of his presentations. All of the energy systems and capacities don't necessarily switch on and off. They happen and interact with each other simultaneously during whatever the physical activity is, especially as time goes on and the athlete needs to recover and starts building up lactate. Now, though repeated sprint ability is touted as entirely alactic and phosphagen dependent in nature, some of the studies that he did with his own players, though it was in relativity to hockey, they still have some of the some similar situations and energy systems and demands in their game as it is on field-based sports. He was taking biopsies of guys' legs in between exercises and basically seeing the energy density and available ATP from interval to interval. I was able to see that it, after 30 seconds of the intervals, the energy system wasn't completely, the phosphagen system was not completely depleted. In fact, while certain areas of your body may be fatigued and feel fatigued, again, an athlete's low back, mid back, or legs may be smoked in certain parts of an exercise or a play, to get more specific, their body shuts things on and off dependent upon what they immediately need. Again, human body, incredibly smart computer. It's going to be able to figure out how to interact and manipulate what it needs at the exact moment it needs it. So rather than focusing in on only power dominant movements or only aerobic dominant movements, they need to be thrown together and combined in some sort of way and fashion. The drills that we present to our athletes during our training sessions. Now, again, we have to, as strength coaches, understand that eventually this thing's going to lead towards us letting go of the reins, to paraphrase, or to throw a phrase. We have to let go of the reins and then relinquish the athlete to their position coach, and they will decide the demands of what they need to be able to do from practice and, again, affecting games. So some ways of varying work to rest ratios. Again, talking about some of those sliders and knobs and things that you can play with as a strength coach. You can either use work to rest ratios or you can use volume. Now, some of the numbers that I have thrown up here are from some of our off-season repeat effort days. This is low CNS work for whenever they need to do repeat sprints. And again, it's sub-maximal, but again, the work that they're receiving is still within the purview of what we're seeking from an energy demand standpoint. So if you don't necessarily need your lineman to run 60 yards, you just chop it down, but then break it in and see how far can my lineman go, how far can my lineman go within this time frame, and then again within this time frame. And you don't need to be stuck and have your nose set on this is how long a play is, so this is the only way that we need to be able to train. This is how long we need to be able to train. Again, going back to what I said before about some of those research case studies, about some of those case studies, is that there is a direct effect from repeat sprint ability and then immediate maximal power under stress conditions, which we constantly see in field-based sport. Especially, you think about the example, it's a 4-series drive and they're all the way down to the 1. They're going to have to push, the defense has been getting driven back and they're going to have to push the goal line. It's been 4 series and they're smoked. I mean, it's still alactic and aerobic power coming together in one. They act synergistically. It's not just necessarily one then the other. It's all at the same time. So some of the other research that I looked into was the Tabata, and then some of the energy substrates, and then measurements that they use from VO2 max directly correlate to MAS, as I discussed before with Jameson. So what they were discussing was the test results that they saw. And again, this is, gleaned this initially from Gamble and then moved into the actual study itself to understand it better. But the test results that they received, that they recorded, proved that when they were moving from about 110 to 150% of total MAS, that there was improvement on aerobic capacity, their anaerobic threshold, their phosphagen system, as well as their ability to produce lactate buffer. So though there was a gradual decline in the actual production of power and their ability to recover, there was still an increase from the athletes that were trained versus the ones that were not trained. Some of the findings from the study was that high intensity interval training, to quote, was that high intensity interval training is considered to result in peripheral adaptations that would enhance the muscle's ability to remove and withstand lactate and resynthesize energy. So again, it's resilience as well as conditioning. So what we see as a whole picture specifically is happening on a molecular level across all energy substrates simultaneously. So some of those other systems that happen to get trained simultaneously, one being the endocrine system. So when we're managing all these things simultaneously from the CNS as well as the actual hormonal response, we have to be able to see what's happening to our athletes specifically and individually. You know, if a guy comes in and he may be cramping, again, we can't expect him to be able to come in and produce a maximal effort from day to day. So we have to be able to use our coach's eye to be able to smarter than just being the straight up robots. You know, there's a happy medium between understanding the numbers and then producing proper results and kind of being more of a traditional hands-on coach and understanding, you know, getting your hands dirty. So stealing from two really good coaches. So initially on the left, I want to discuss Charlie Francis high-low modeling and how we might be able to actually, so the high-low modeling, how we might be able to actually predict and then look at this from like a weekly basis. So given the 48-hour rule of a high CNS day, it's likely also going to be extremely peripherally fatiguing, not peripherally fatiguing, but fatiguing on our phosphagen system. God. So we have to be able to account and then not relax, but kind of reel the training in and not necessarily drive your guys into the ground. Otherwise, you're going to end up pulling a hamstring or some sort of other soft tissue injury is likely to occur. And that's not necessarily to say that you have to do nothing and then take it easy on the days in between. Again, as I was discussing before with repeat sprint ability, it can be submaximal effort and still train those aerobic systems. And then you still gain maximal alactic capacity, maximal alactic capacity from training those systems. It's a thing about like increasing the stroke on a piston versus, increasing the bore on a piston versus increasing the stroke. And then again, looking towards Alvar Meal's explanation of how we need to be able to incorporate this as we progress training is that instead of like event-specific athletes event-specific athletes where they eventually taper their training to be more and more specific as they get closer to their event, we need to be as general as possible and non-specific in our skill acquisition and adaptation, and then broaden the horizon in the amount of movements and movement patterns that our athletes are able to comprehensively understand and then reproduce. Football is kind of a chaotic and hectic game. There's always a lot going on, and it's never a dull moment. So what does it look like? What does it look like? So on some of these high CNS days, again, where we're trying to get some of the maximal effort out of our athletes, it's pretty easy to see. You know, anyone who's been out and actually coached a sprint day in a session understands what an athlete's going to look like whenever they're sprinting as hard as they possibly can. They're kind of kyphotically bound up, maybe pumping their fists as hard as they can. Their face and their tendons are going. But though we may, try to coach against some of those things and try to get them to be a little bit more efficient in their systems, it's still pretty easy to see. You don't necessarily have to pull the guy off, and do a biopsy or hook them up to some sort of EKG machine, EKG, heart rate monitor, every single rep. Going back to what Coach Carrasio said in his discussion about the coach's eye, you can see some of the leaks, some of the ooze. That was the phrase he uttered. Some of the ooze whenever you're observing an athlete, whenever they fall out of posture, is immediately and very easy to tell that even a novice coach is able to understand. So I got some of the examples here. You'll have to forgive me again, like Coach said, we're kind of shorthanded here in the fact that we're not immediately given access to some of the tools that we've had in the past. So some of the examples in the division of how we might prescribe some exercises on the field in an actual outside environment during a session with some of our heavier guys. My example here on the left would be a med ball throw or a med ball bound. In the pictures diagram that he's got kind of an overhand position, but we typically want to have them in an underhand position, again, bound out as hard and as far as they possibly can, and then immediately have to load up and then produce force and then throw up as hard and as far as they possibly can. Now, the repeated effort of this and progression of this is where we eventually develop their energy systems. But the specificity in how we make linemen do this rather than mids or skills, and again, wherever those lines fall kind of depend upon what the the position coach determines initially, is going to affect how their training overall ends up whenever the season comes around. Then again, I have another example here for what we might do for some of the skill players. Try to play that through a couple times so you can see. So again, it's a max effort exercise, and it can be repeated and kind of scaled up or scaled down however many times or ways that we need to be able to express stress to our athletes and get whatever we need out of them from that day. Yep. Again, where you might have the division lines between big, mid, and skill kind of depends upon some preset decisions. So again, if you'll direct your attention to the trap bar here, one of the exercises you might have for a more push-based athlete, someone who's a little bit closer to the ball, is a trap bar jump. Again, developing some of those energy systems, the phosphagen energy system, we're able to scale this up and scale this down so we can get an aerobic effect or entirely anaerobic effect. Again, it's dependent upon how you attenuate volume and then pace of the lift itself, as opposed to something that's a little bit more geared towards sprinting we have for our skill athletes on the right. I'll play that through a couple times. Again, some of the sports specificity has to start tapering towards the game itself. Now, these are some of the more general examples of what we might use in the off season. But again, you have to understand that not everything's going to look perfect, right? You have to allow for the athlete to kind of understand and eventually develop some of that the peripheral CNS development, where they'll eventually understand the exercise, and then you'll be able to get a little bit better sense of where the athlete's energy systems might be. Right. So we have to have efficient measurements. So again, we can't necessarily use MAS or VO2 max or biopsies in the middle of a practice or a session whenever we're out in the field. So leaning towards some of the more practical methods, again, the coach's eye, and then playing with what we understand the exercise to look like, you can then start kind of messing with distances and times and intervals. And then again, some of the modalities of training themselves. So a chase environment, or excuse me, a chase-based drill in the environment, the athletes naturally going to, competitive athletes naturally going to be able to produce more from a neurological standpoint. And again, that's some of that CNS development that we can kind of manipulate and then use for some of their energy development, right? 85 to 100 players all with masks on or getting needles in their leg, just, it ain't going to happen. So we as coaches have to observe and copy what does work and then reject what doesn't. So some of the more practical examples of what we may be able to use, and then actually use some of the data provided by these GPS systems are things like polar and open field, catapult and open field. So there's pluses and minuses. Some of the benefits, we see that we can have individualized profiles, so we can get really specific with some of our athletes, and then kind of scale it up or down, depending upon what's most important, or what we might see as coaches needs to be observed more. And then again, we can kind of track some of the implementation of our exercises and see what does work and what doesn't work. So then we can kind of track on a timeline the same way that we might track an in-game or a live session. We can see what's happening immediately. We can compare apples to apples and say, this exercise worked and this exercise doesn't. Some of them actually have heart rate monitors built into them. So HRV alongside with VO2 max is actually a really good indication of what we're getting out of the athletes and what they're getting out of the exercise itself. Some of the drawbacks, though, are in some cases reliability, although they're getting better, in my opinion. And then the cost-benefit analysis. Not every university necessarily has $100,000 to just dump in a GPS tracking or heart rate monitors. So again, you can kind of use some of those more rudimentary skills and adaptations we have as strength coaches to attenuate volume and then track and observe what your athletes are doing. So just some of the characteristics of the phases that we might go through. So the off season, there's greatly more volume done in the weight room. We're almost the primary coach that they're going to see as athletes. The strength coach is like the first line or whatever. And then the training taper should introduce more and more volume, again, relative to whatever practices are going to be. So going back to some of the specificity, working under Coach Kier Wenham Flat, divided it into 3, and that's generally what I'm able to observe across a wide variety of coaches in America, compared with coaches like Tim Karen, where he just divides it to inside and outside the box. At Army, when they had the triple option, it's just dependent upon play styles. You have to understand what the demands are going to be when they're coming, and then what it should look like when the time comes. And then again, the last little bit of the energy system development are some of the dietary needs and developments, what they need to be honed in on at that moment. You're going to have the most time with them during the off season, so you might as well educate your athletes what they need to be eating, what they need to be drinking, what they don't need to be drinking, what they don't need to be eating, some of the other sleep habits and stuff like that. Going into the preseason, training camp, some other voluminous times whenever they're on the field. The training knowledge should carry over from off season to preseason, right? They're not going to just automatically forget how to do a power clean. They're going to not forget how to do a trap bar jump. That being said, there still will be some drop off, and you should not necessarily introduce new training modalities to the program. Now, some of the efficiencies and proficiencies of the athlete during the sessions need to improve and need to visually improve. Otherwise, they need to be regressed and drawn back because something else isn't clicking. It's not necessarily just them getting smoked during a workout and not being able to breathe. Then again, you're going to transition into them going into more practices, right? Lifts tend to be more maintenance based, and same thing goes for running or conditioning. Anything on foot is going to be compared to what's already been done for us as strength coaches. And then I've seen from observing some GPS numbers, generally speaking, depending upon what kind of play style there is, for some skill players, there's going to be about 5,000 to 6,500 yards of total ground contact, or total ground contact times. And again, some of the beliefs that have been instilled within me is that intensity should fluctuate in volume, not necessarily percentages. You still need to be able to train heavy. Likewise, you still need to be able to produce a significant amount of power, jump high, jump far, or throw far, whatever the case may be. And, at the end of the day, it's go time. Whenever the season comes, they need to be ready. If you're training for conditioning, by the time the season shows up, it's already too late. It's the same thing like if you're trying to drink water right before a training session, you're already dehydrated. Like you're a day late and $1 short. It's too far gone at that point. And then again, this cannot be stressed enough, is that there really needs to be regenerative focus around your training sessions and how you periodize and plan them out. So just a quick point is some of the detraining that you're going to be able to observe during some off seasons and in between periods. The transitional stages like spring break and then winter break and things like that. Found some information from DuPont talking about him observing detraining of MAS levels from athletes after a 4-week break. Dependent upon the training age and the level of athlete that you have, could be anywhere from 5 to 15%. And then again, with the frequency in training and how prepared they initially were. So then some of the training modalities are going to be the most paramount in what you choose to use in the later weeks of the season. Once you start getting towards a national title run, you can't be throwing 95, 100% on their back or on the bar every time you go into the weight room, and you only may get a certain amount of training sessions depending upon what bowl season is looking like. So just wrapping up, I'd like to open the forum up if there's any questions or comments or concerns. Again, I'd like to thank everybody who allowed me to get to this point, as well as everybody who produced just fantastic information and research that allowed me to delve into this topic. So then I'd like to open the floor to questions. I'm going to try to read over here. Looks like we don't have anything on YouTube. Turn to the panel. You guys have anything? Make sure I'm not missing anything here. All right. Looks like we're good. Okay, this time I'd like to turn it over to Zach Higginbotham. Zach, you good to go?
Yeah, I just need to share my screen, right? So
Yep.
Share. Let's go to desktop. You guys good? You guys see my screen?
Yes, sir.
All right, so how's everybody doing? My name is Zach Higginbotham. I'm the associate head strength coach here at FAU with Joey. Glad I'm here, honored to speak, and I'm glad all y'all stuck around and watched. Today, I'm going to be speaking on overspeed sprinting, considerations and applications in collegiate football and overall field sport athletes, really. I want to give a big thank you to some of my mentors, former supervisors, and also give credit to people I've stolen information from. Again, I'm not the smartest guy around. I'll just say I'm lucky enough to learn how to emulate and do good work from other people I've watched. So I want to give a big thank you to Scott Sinclair, Joe Walker, Orlando Smith, Austin Ardrey, Joey Garasio, John Garish, Kier Wenham Flat, Al Miller, Rob Panarello, Johnny Parker, Miki Murati, Kurt Hester, and a ton of other people that have helped me along the way. There's a lot of other people I could have named. So I just want to say thank you to them. And then others in the bottom, I just want to say thank you for providing good work and being able to help develop athletic development in your own athletes and help and give us tools that progress our athletes as coaches. So again, like I said, I'm the creator of none and stealer of everything, as Coach Parker would say. Let's see if this will change. Maybe. All right, so sorry about that. So when it comes to running, it's simple, right? Just run fast. Rest, yes and no, right? It depends. Sorry about that. This computer's a little slow. It's a pretty big file. All right, so the intent to run fast is simple, right? It just run fast, right? You try really hard, give great effort, right? But what happens when that no longer works? What happens when the basics no longer work, right? Every principle we're taught as coaches, we're taught as athletes, is from a bottom-up approach, from slow to fast, from simple to easy, a bottom-up approach to athletes. Even like when we're taught to coach, we're taught to teach from the ground up, right? But what happens when that no longer works? What happens when our athletes become stagnant and we have to find new ways to address these focuses, specifically sprinting? What happens if we approach sprinting itself with a top-down focus and we address it from the brain to the floor instead of the floor up? Why is this not changing? Right. So you look at athletic development, right? The reason why speed is so important is it's the high point of the pyramid. It's the peak of athletic development. Alvermeer will tell you in his hierarchy development. I know you guys have seen this a ton in terms of this specific pyramid of development, right? But the biggest reason why is the reason why everybody's telling to do it. You talk about residual effects and residual effects of training. Everybody's talking about it. So it sounds like the key phrase, and it's kind of falling mute a little bit on Twitter. Everybody's talking about it because it's so important, right? There's such a trickle down effect to how we're teaching these things and how we're training our athletes, because it has the biggest bang for its buck in terms of affecting all points of the pyramid, right? And as Tony Holler would say, in terms of why it's important, speed grows like a tree, right? Plant early and plant often. That's why I put bamboo trees in my title page. Everybody's like, why the hell are you doing that? Right? Because it takes the bamboo tree at least 2 years to sprout from the ground, right? So we have to plant early, right? We have to find a way to prioritize it early on in training and make it a priority, right? And then we also have to find a way to effectively train it year round and all the time and make it a priority, right? Because you have to, when you look at the bamboo tree, you have to nurture, you have to grow it, you have to be patient, you have to be diligent, because it takes 2 years to sprout from the ground, and you have to be patient and diligent with it. Let's see. Right, and in terms of sports, like in terms of field sport athletes and football, what do we care about speed? What pieces specifically? Because you're going to hear a lot of terms and a lot of vague track terms and stuff that don't necessarily apply to field sport athletes when there's so many different things we have to affect, right? The two biggest pieces we're going to look at today and talk about today, and I think are most important, is max velocity, which is honestly the only way to look at it is the highest point of velocity you can reach per unit of time or overall, right? What is the highest attainable velocity that athlete can reach, right? The acceleration, the rate of change to get to the highest velocity. How long can they accelerate? Because the faster the athlete, the longer they're in accelerating, right? And then you look at how all these different pieces that we're going to talk about today flow into, and I want to give a little bit of background information when we start talking about these different things and different principles, because they're so important, right? Or posture, intent, and dosage. When you think about posture, right? It's so important, one, because if they can't hit these certain positions of posture, we talk about Altus refers to it as shapes, right? They're not going to be able to maximize their force production, their force capabilities. And secondly, for our end of what we need to do, right, is they have to play the sport. So we have to keep them healthy, right? That's the biggest point of them being able to hit these postures and shapes we want, is intent, right? The intent to do something and drive it with great intensity, right? To drive adaptation with sprinting, right? You can't sprint, you can't train with half effort. So, and then dosage. For us on our side of things, are we doing enough, one, to keep them healthy and drive adaptation, or are we doing too much, right? Now I know you guys have seen this chart a ton, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but essentially sprinting is so important because, again, it's the highest point of the threshold in terms of motor unit involvement, athletic development. I know if you guys have done any or half the webinars talking about on YouTube and Instagram and IG, everybody's talked about this. So I'll just touch on a little bit. The reason why we program sprints is because there's such a high involvement, right? So I'll go into it. Now, kind of getting into the nitty gritty, get a little more specific and closer to our goal of the conversation, right? Is how does all this play in this field sport athletes and track athletes, right? Because when you think about hip height, ground contact times, all these differences between field sport athletes, right? Are these golden positions, are these shapes that we're asking our players and our athletes to get into that are based off track athletes, are they synonymous with what we want to do, right? Are they actually attainable? Right, because elite sprinters are going to get good front side lift. They're going to be able to create more vertical force because they attack the ground from the top up. Because again, they create vertical force. They get that swing leg time to come through. They're going to strike in relative great position within the center of mass. And you look at field sport athletes. Field sport athletes are going to be the exact opposite, right? They're going to sag in their hips. A lot of times they're going to be push runners. A lot of football players are going to be quad and low back dominant. They're not going to rely on their hamstrings and their glutes, right? They're going to have longer ground contact times. They're going to strike less than the 4 foot, more of a full foot contact because of proprioceptive and environmental changes they need where they have to change direction or react to a stimulus outside of them, right? And a lot of times because of all these different effects, they strike outside of the front of their hip, and that's why a lot of guys, honestly, outside of mechanical issues or loading issues and tissue issues, they pull their hamstrings, right? So the short answer is yes. Like we want to be able to teach them and get them into these positions, but the reality of it is the demands of the game say they're probably not going to all the time, or they're not going to be able to based on some relative differences. What the hell? Sorry about that. Right. So now, first part of talking about overspeed and all these different pieces we're going to get into is dynamic systems theory, right? All it is the study of movement based on different interactions within the environment and the task and the individual, right? And how they all respond to create one overall unit, right? Franz Bosch is going to talk about it, how all these different positions and all these different environments, he talks about it a ton. There's certain things that stay the same no matter the constant or the constraints or the individual task and differences in task at hand. And there's some things that fluctuate based off these 3 different positions, whether it's individual, environmental, or task, right? The biggest piece we're going to talk about today that I think has the biggest outside of the box thinking when it comes to overspeed and sprinting, especially with field sport athletes, and honestly teaching in general, is motor learning, right? Because the body is so complex physiologically, the body restricts itself for safety reasons with degrees of movement, right? In order to to deal with all these differences and possibilities, right? So just think about a teaching progression. How would you teach a squat? How would you teach a kid to sprint? How would you teach a kid to clean? Right? Usually it's going to be a part whole method or a part whole method, right? And you're going to teach slow to fast, simple to complex, goblet squat, the front squat, the back squat. And you're going to add intensity. You're going to add variation. All these different ways to challenge the body and groove these optimal positions we're looking for, right? And we'll get into how they fit into dynamic systems theory here in a second, right? But if you really want to get deep out of the weeds, and I'll touch on it here in a second, but I want to get to the good stuff, right? And if you look at some of the ideas of motor learning, where it comes from Franz Bosch or Nikolai Bernstein, you look at the motor pathways and motor learning, right? It falls in a parabolic relationship, right? Early on, you watch your athletes, you watch how they're learning and figuring out the movement. You're trying to coach them and cue them, right? They don't have a lot of ways because they don't understand these movement patterns, how to problem solve, right? So you get kids and you say you're squatting them, right? And they're shaking like a stripper. They don't have great motor control, right? They don't have a lot of ways to show mastery in the movement. But as you cue them and they rep it and they figure it and they organize themselves, right? They fall into that level 2 where they limit their degrees of freedom and they're starting to gain technical mastery, right? And as they get there, right, the movement, and they can start exploring, they start gaining degrees of freedom, right? And as they get those degrees of freedom, we have to find ways to challenge them, right? So we have to find ways to change the environment, to change the stimulus, right? And that's coaching in a nutshell, right? Because we're trying to drive adaptation, we're trying to drive stimulus, right? Now, again, everybody's kind of like, what the hell are we talking about? I thought overspeed just meant towing and above maximal velocity, above maximal peak velocities and all these different things, right? But when we challenge the body through specific tasks and through the environment and your self-constraints, right, we're forcing the body to respond in a more perfect manner. We might be forcing things to happen faster, right? Because the idea is we're trying to force a neurological response from the brain. Remember, we're teaching it from the top down. So we're forcing a fight or flight response, right? Because why? Because if you don't run better, you don't run faster, you don't improve, the proverbial bear, or in this case, a hippo, is going to get you, right? If old boy doesn't get to a toe-off position, he's going to get eaten, and that ain't good. Right? Now, when you start getting into how these different pieces change and don't change and how they move, right? You start talking about, Franz Bosch can refer to them as attractors and fluctuations, right? Attractors are those basic movement patterns that don't change, right? Those are those golden positions we're looking to get to and find it, as Stu McMillan referred to as a bandwidth, right? We're trying to fit into that certain bandwidth within the golden position, right, that we want. Fluctuations are all those different pieces we talked about, the environment, the task, or the individual, that all might change based off a given stimulus. Those are all those different pieces. And if you look at if you look at the page, you look at the picture on the side, right? Those attractive positions, right? We want to deepen them. And as they learn, the motor learning and improves, and as we expose them to, right? Those attractor wells deepen. Same thing with the fluctuations, right? But the attractor positions are more ingrained. And what we're trying to do is get the body to accept those attractors and be able to get to those attractors and golden positions faster and more frequently based off the given fluctuations, right? Maybe. Apologize. Right? So for sprinting, here we go. When we get to sprinting, we talk about all these different golden positions and attractors and fluctuations, right? What are these attractors, right? And these are the different positions you're going to hear me talk about today. Is toe off, MVP, strike, touchdown, full support. And we can get into the weeds a little bit on what these individual positions look like and how we get to them, and what they are in depth and what they are in their whole. But at least we just want to show you guys. This is pulled straight from the Altus Kinogram method, from Altus and Stu McMillan and Dan Paff. And if you guys haven't read it, at least that, I would go right to it, because it's going to be able to help you, give you a coach's eye and help develop what you're looking for in sprinters and your athletes as a whole, right? Now, why is all this important, right? Why are we trying to develop these positions and develop and obtain higher velocities and improve acceleration, right? And improve all this, right? Because if we make them faster, if we give them higher peak velocities, if we raise all that, right, we're going to raise their acceleration profile. And this is pulled straight from one of Ken Clark's, this graph right here is pulled straight from Ken Clark's presentation in 2017 at TFC. And I want to give him credit because the work he's done and that study was based off, that presentation was done off the study he did for the NFL Combine at 40-yard dashes, right? And what they found is when you raise the peak velocity, when you raise the highest attainable velocity or speed they can achieve, you raise your ability to accelerate. And what do coaches always tell you? Oh, it's an acceleration sport. Like, all we do is accelerate. How often do our athletes hit max velocity or get to a point to where we have to train those qualities, right? But again, if we raise the max velocity, if we raise their overall ability to velocity, they can accelerate for longer. So again, you think about, you watch two kids sprint, the faster kid, more than likely, when you watch the sprint, they're going to be pretty close early on, but you're going to see that other kids start to pull away because he can accelerate for longer. His rate of change is higher, right? Because he can get to a higher velocity, and the graph shows that, right? And remember, when we do this, we're trying to speed up the brain, right? We're trying to force it to respond in a more perfect manner. We're trying to speed the process up, right? So all this is going to start tying together. And the other thing is peak velocities, max velocity training is going to give you certain and specific neural adaptations you can't get in any other facility of training that you can get, right? So we're trying to load the CNS. We're trying to give it neural input. We're trying to do all these different things. And again, putting it all together, some of these points, I kind of jumped the gun a little bit. And you look at some more Ken Clark graphs from the same presentation. You can see all these different pieces, right? Faster athletes are going to accelerate for longer. They're going to be able to create more net horizontal force, more vertical force. Their ground contact times are going to be shorter. They're going to be able to accelerate for longer. So when you look at all these different things, faster athletes, like for example, are going to create more force, and they're going to be able to reapply that force. So the ground contact times are going to be longer. And again, you can see where they apply for longer. And looking directly at football, right? You think about what do most coaches tell you? You look at most graphs with track related. They say, oh, the 100-meter dash is going to anywhere based on ability. They're going to accelerate for 30 to 60 meters. But when you look at football, you're going to watch some linemen, and they're going to be in top end mechanics at 5 yards, right? And there's a lot of other factors that go into that. So some skilled players are going to be in top end mechanics at 10, 12 yards. I don't have the exact number in front of me, but it's going to be right around 20 yards. They're going to be right around 90% of their max velocity. And that's going to be the rate of changing that's gonna be minimal to none. And they still got half of the 40-yard dash to run. You want to watch your athletes and watch how they accelerate and how they change speeds. Like watch your shin angles, right? Because the shin angles are going to be able to tell you a lot more about the body and their abilities as a sprinter. And this will all kind of fit in more later once we start getting to some of the applied section and the drills. All right, you got to steal some time before the slide changes. Right now, what does the research say? We talked about motor learning and how that fits in, and that's going to be a big piece of what we talk about. But now we're going to start talking about the 2-mass model, stumble reflex, and assisted sprinting. And again, I want to give a big shout out to Chris Corfus, Tony Holler, Kim Clark, Peter Wayne, and a lot of these guys are light years ahead of all of us for kind of shedding a light on some of this stuff, because it's great stuff if you can learn how to apply it, learn how it fits what you and your program do, right? So what the hell is a 2-mass model, right? The 2-mass model, all it tells us, and I know Coach Joey talked a little bit earlier in his early presentation. All it tells us how forces are applied and velocities are improved, ground reaction forces are improved. And when they develop a good 2-mass model, you're going to see a great knee lift, right? Elite sprinters are going to get a great post position in that front side swing leg, right? They're going to be able to get maximal hip projection because there's a certain amount of time that swing leg is able to get through. And the more time you give that swing leg to get around and get an optimal position, the more it's going to be able to speed up and create force, right? Because I know you talk about the positioning, right? Think about a ballerina or an ice skater, right? And they start spinning in circles, right? When they pull that knee and they pull that leg in and they make that mass smaller, start speeding up, right? And what do when they slow down? They straighten that leg out. Well, when you think about your swing leg's the same thing, right? If I can get my hips higher and get to a bit more optimal position and get that swing leg up underneath the knee more and shorten the distance it takes to spin through, I can speed it up, right? And we know from the 2-mass model that the highest forces are obtained, the forces that are obtained and created in ground contacts is from that first position, right? Is that first stiff strike, how to speed up that swing leg and being able to slow down that swing leg, right? So once you make ground contact, how quickly can I decelerate that swing leg? How can I create ground reaction forces and reapply it back in the ground? And Peter Wayne describes it as like throwing a punch to the ground with your foot, right? So it's not a passive motion. It's aggressive and it's violent. Awkward silence. We're going to try to get this slide to load. I apologize. Right. Jump the gun a little bit. So now we start talking about the stumble reflex. What the hell is a stumble reflex, right? The stumble reflex is your body's safety mechanism for when you fall or trip, and it's going to cause a pre-tensioning in the body, right? So think about it. When you're aloof, as some would say, right? And you go to trip over a curb or you trip on a sidewalk, right? And you're at next step, you strike the ground and it's really stiff and you try to catch yourself, right? That's a stumble reflex in a nutshell. Because what you look at the study above, and I won't get too deep in the weeds with it, right? Is what they did is they literally tripped cats, right? And what they found is when they tripped the cats or they gave them a stimulus to the swing leg or to the stance leg, there was a stiffer spring, there was a stiffer extension rate, right? There was a stiffer reflex on that flexion moment of subsequent cycle, right? So what they found was doing that, they created a stiffer spring. And we know the stiffer the spring, the faster the velocity, the quicker we can decelerate, the more forces we can apply, right? And we know in elite athletes, their ability to accelerate, decelerate, and be a higher level athlete is their ability to shut off and turn on muscles and flip between agonists and antagonists, right? And we know it's based off this study and other sprint kinematics, right? Stiffer ankle complexes are going to create more vertical forces based off an elastic return. And we know in max velocity sprinting, higher vertical forces are what we're looking for. Here we go. All right, so now get into some towing research, because I know that's what everybody's talking about. That's everybody wants to hear, everybody wants to talk about. And sadly, we're not going to get too much into it, right? Because the nature of field sport athletes and being a strength coach is we can't do too much, and we talk more about it because of the safety of keeping our paychecks, right? But if you look at the study Kim Clark and Chris Corvus did a few years ago, when they pulled kids and they did motorized towing. Sorry, we got a big itch. When you look at the studies, what they did is everybody here hopefully know what a fly 10 is. If not, we can talk about it. But what they did was they set up a fly 10 zone. They took a bunch of high school age kids, junior, senior, average to above average track sprinters, right? And what they did was they pulled them through a timing gate system, a fly 10 system, right? And what they found is by increasing their maximal output, right, above 100%, they decreased ground contact times by just a little bit more than 5%. That's fast, right? When you start talking about the difference between 1.0 and 0.89 or 0.8 in elite level sprinters, right, versus sub-elite, that's not a lot of time. But you start thinking about the forces and speeds created, it's a ton, right? Flight times were increased not by stride length or stride frequency, but because of higher levels of vertical forces when they towed these kids through. And what they ended up doing is there was almost a 9.5% increase in maximal velocity, right? And that's huge when you talk about the differences in times we have to do these things. And if you look at, and if you're versed and if you're not versed, or if you look more into it and the sprint coaching and some of these higher other coaches, and again, like I don't know a whole lot. I'm just good at emulating other people. But you're going to see with track coaches and what a lot of high-level sprint coaches in the past were going to say is towing doesn't work because you're going to increase ground contact times. You're going to increase stride lengths, right? You're going to increase braking forces because it's unnatural. It's an out-of-body experience, and you're going to reinforce poor mechanics and striking in the front of the hip, right? And you're going to create braking force on the hamstring, and you could end up pulling a hamstring, right? But in reality, the situation was, as they went faster, mechanics improved, they increased vertical force, and they decreased ground contact times. And there wasn't a degradation or deformation in mechanics, right? So actually it improved, right? Now, what do I do if I don't like my job, right? Or what if I do like my job? I could tell you what you do if you don't like it, but what do I do if I do like my job, right? Most coaches probably can't or actuality of team and group settings or safety of because one is to keep the kids safe and keep your own hide safe, right? So they won't tow them, right? But if you were to tow them, right, it only takes a few steps to give an out-of-body experience, to give a neurological adaptation. Remember, it's just like a 1 rep max. It's an above 100%. So it only takes 1, 2, 3 steps for the body to feel it, right? That's why if Charlie Francis, if his athletes PR'd, they were done for the day because you want that one single stimulus to apply, and it doesn't take much, right? Al Miller always talked about, as soon as, to me, as I was growing, even now, every time he reminds me, as soon as a kid has 100% plus out-of-body experience, stop. Right? Because the body's never felt it before, right? Put the brakes on and let the body feel it, right? Now, if you were to tow a kid, right, you could use a bungee hookup. I wouldn't at max velocity just for practicality, safety reasons. I think you could, some acceleration stuff, some stuff that we played with as a staff, as a group, as a CSU, personalities, practicality. I haven't towed kids just from I think there's better ways to do it in terms of efficacy and keeping kids safe. But if you were to do it, I know people that have done it with the 1080, if it allows in your budget. But again, in that area specifically in towing kids, I would say proceed with caution, right? And again, based off of research, you only need 103, you can get up to 103, 104% of maximal output, right? Now, the reality of what everyday overspeed you could do as a coach and as your group, right? A good strength coach should always know where the wind blows, right? You should always be checking the weather. 1, in case you need to go to a plan B session. And 2, like as a good sprint coach, it's always going to run with the wind, right? You're always going to run with the wind. Or if you follow TFC and you follow anything they do, right? And you talk to Tony Holler and you listen to him talk, right? He's going to refer to the gauntlet, right? And the gauntlet, all it is whatever your timing zones are, your timing areas, where it's 10s, 20s, a lot of the time for those guys, it's fly 10s, right? All the other athletes that aren't running are going on the sides of the gate, and they're providing an outside external stimulus to produce a fight or flight response. They give that athlete an out-of-body experience, right? Because it's a fight or flight response that we're talking about, right? We're trying to train the brain to give an adaptation. Right? Now, remember, our goals with overspeed and all this different motor learning, right, is we're trying to strengthen the tractors and expose the body to fluctuations, right? Just to refresh and make sure we're on track and where we're going, right? James Smith, I think is a good quote. If you've read Applied Sprinting, if you haven't, I would. I know you're waiting for real answers and applied principles. I won't read this, but essentially what he's saying is all the drill work, that this is where the biggest thing I've found in overspeed is for motor learning. Is the drill work and how it fits into overspeed. And James Smith will explain it as it's a way to stress the body and strengthen the tractors without giving too much neurological stress to the athletes, right? And again, I know this is a little off topic, but if you look at James Smith in the last point of this paragraph, a couple sentences, he talks about sprint presenting minimal stress of the hamstrings, right? And I know with the COVID-19 and everything going on, great coaches, right, in these next couple of months, and great head guys and guys that are overseeing and training, they're going to be able to judge their program and how other kids are responding by the health of their hamstrings on a daily basis. If your kids are blown out and your kids are trying, they're fatigued and they're in a hard point of training and their hamstrings are blown out and you're not expecting it, there's probably an issue, right? The gauge of the health and daily readiness of your athlete's hamstrings are going to be a big guide of where they're at, especially going forward with a potentially limited schedule we have, right? Now let's start getting into some of the drill variations of what I use and what I like for me and what I've found useful for me and my athletes, right? This all can fit one-on-one sessions, group sessions, right? But anytime we change the drill, we change the stimulus, we change the environment, we're providing a new stimulus, right? We're giving a different fluctuation. As long as the attractor stays the same, we're trying to still maintain toe off, the MVP pose, right? Mid stance, all these different things, right? But we change the fluctuation. We're providing a new environment for that attractor to strengthen and learn, right? And that could be varying the arms, varying the hands, right? Stick variations, out in front, overhead, med ball variations. If you talk about the torque potential and the rotational component, sprinting and co-contractions, you can start talking about weighted variations. If you get into the stumble reflex and how the body reacts to the stumble reflex, you can talk about raised surfaces, right? Providing a new stimulus for the body to control. Right? It's all about controlled creativity. And as we'll kind of get here in a second, there's a method to the madness, right? When you think about this, anytime we do these different things, right? And you're going to see with a lot of these drills, anytime we provide a new environment, we change the drill, we change the environment, we change the stimulus, we provide a new environment. I apologize, right? We force the body to respond in a more perfect manner, right? We force the body to create a stiffer spring, to get to those attractors faster and use them more often, right? And a lot of the times you see with these different variations, the upper body, the more unstable it is, because the safety our body's looking for from the neurological piece, it wants to respond in a more perfect manner, right? So each variation kind of has its own different little piece of the puzzle as we're trying to solve this whole thing together, right? So anytime an athlete is late in their gait, they're late in their mid stance, for me, what I found works for me based off of what I've learned from Chris Korfis, Ken Clark, all those different guys, right? Boom, short wickets, med ball runs, toe off. You can use no arms, right? You can play with the arms. Captain Morgan's ever posted on my Twitter a couple of days ago. Stick runs. You could toe. Towing obviously works for all this. Again, I think it helps with toe off because toe off is the most attractive. Again, I just realized let me go back to this real quick because I know with this thing freezing up, we kind of skipped a couple of slides when it froze up. So before we get too deep in the weeds, all right, I just want to hit these real quick. Okay. It's being kind of finicky and loading, so I apologize for missing these slides, right? So again, we talked about all these different positions. Well, what the hell is an attractor for sprinting, right? It's toe off. Toe off is the #1 position for sprinting. It's being able to limit rotation and maximize force production through that stance legged, right? And like, again, we talked about, I'll rehash it real quick. And you talk about the lateral chain, like the obliques, the lateral oblique, the QL, all that hip musculature, they create stabilization in that stance leg, right? And then you talk about in the lateral chain, right? And you think about pushing, right? If you look back at the graph, we can look at the end, right? If you think about great athletes, if you watch a 5'10" athlete run and they run at a great speed, they're going to look like they're 6 foot, 6'1" if you run from the side because their hips are going to raise. And you talk about that maximal vertical projection, right? So the opposite side of the pelvis has to be able to raise and maximize force output in that stance leg, right? And that's a great position. That's a great position and a attractor for sprinting, right? You talk about touchdown. Athletes are always cueing toes up, stiff ankles, right? Flex the foot, right? Because we're trying to limit the amount of plantar flexion of the foot, because when you look at sprinters, they're going to have a neutral foot, and it's the ability, how fast can they strike the ground, load that ankle complex, load that Achilles, right? And then push back through it and creating force, right? And those ground reaction forces, those high vertical forces, and creating a return on energy, right? And I apologize. Let's just do this because it's going to be easier. I always save time. Right now, fluctuations for sprinting and field sport athletes as a whole. All right, we'll get this shit right, I promise. All right. So when you talk about fluctuations in sprinting, right? We talk about the difference between elite athletes and elite sprinters and high-level sprinters and field sport athletes and sub-elite, right? The biggest thing is going to be that high knee position, that maximal vertical projection, that front side lift. Again, most athletes aren't going to hit this, right? Because there's so many different outside environmental factors or sub-elite, whether it's velocity-based or biomechanical, they're not going to be able to hit this. But the biggest, they can, but the reality is in competition and practice and a lot of the things they do, they're not going to. But as they should be able to, the idea is this is going to change based off the environmental task, right? And then you talk about arm action, right? How often do our athletes and football players specifically, since we're talking about it, how often do they run in a purely sagittal plane with their eyes and shoulders right on top of their hips, right? They have to separate, they have to change direction, they have to do all these different things, right? And again, now you can kind of see how we're talking about these different positions, now it plays into, and we went over a second, so I'll kind of pass it real quick, right? Again, we kind of talked about that. I apologize for missing it. I was skipping through. I'm just going to do this because it's going to be easier. Again, before we start getting into the drill work, because I know we missed a slide, I want to hit it real quick, right? Again, ask yourself, what positions are my players in most of the time, right? Just like we talk about, track athletes have to run tall, they have to run sagittal, right? And their hips are on top of their shoulders. They have great posture all the time, and then they turn left, right? All our athletes, field athletes, have to do all these different things, right? So what positions and different positions are my athletes in all the time, right? How often in the open field, right? And you think receivers and DBs and safeties, you have to go track balls, their hips are separated from their shoulders. They have to go high point balls. A receiver has to track a 9 cut over the shoulder and their eyes are separated from where their hips are going, right? And all these different things are fluctuations in how we're coaching sprinting, right? And and that's an environmental change, right? But they still have to be able to hit these attractive positions we're looking for. Right. And we got in the research a little bit. Again, I apologize. Right. So let's go right here, because this is where we left off before we realized we missed some slides. Right. So again, now you can kind of see what the attractors are for our field sport athletes, our elite level sprinters, all these different things, right? And now, what do we use, right? When we talked about the quote from James Smith about how all these different drills give contextual sense, prep the tissues for work, right? The first thing most coaches do, and a lot of the great coaches I think that are great at developing speed and power in their athletes, most of the time they're going to start with an A walk, an A march, an A skip, and A run, and they're referred to as the mock drills from Gerard Mock, right? But they give contextual sense to higher velocities, and they prep the athlete for these attractive positions we want to hit. And also, as they speed up, we're prepping these tissues and then preparing these elastic qualities that we want in our sprinters. And again, they promote coordination, rhythm, and relaxation. And some would argue that they don't necessarily fit the demand, but I would say there's an in-between, right? Everything has its place, right? But when it comes to the overspeed and some of these motor learning patterns that I want to drill, and I found it work for me. Again, we talked about motor learning, going slow to fast, simple to complex. This is where I start adding in some of these different variations we talked about on the previous slide first, right? Because it's the slowest thing we've done. It's the first thing they're going to get technical mastery in, and all these different pieces, right? So it's the first place I start, right? In the video, the couple of videos I got coming up, or example of a return to play kid I worked with here this past winter at CSU, right? An overhead. We know any overhead arm variations are going to develop the lateral sling, develop that extension reflex. You can see it's just an A run. His ankles are okay. I'd like to see a little bit more of a neutral foot on ground contact, right? And again, from him, if I was really going back and trying to be perfect, I'm not the best with getting videos, recording videos, because I'm trying to watch the kid move from different angles. When I'm trying to cue a lateral sling, I actually want to watch the kid from the front, and I'll watch him from behind, because a lot of the time I want to see him be able to get that hip lock position. I want to see that foot strike right underneath the hip, right? And again, because of this different A run, right, and all these different pieces, because they can get to that hip lock, they can get that extension reflex, they can give that swing leg time to come through, right? And then we talk about that two mass model, creating higher levels of ground reaction forces and all those different pieces. Let's see if this next video will load. Here we go. Same thing, just a different variation. The same drill, an A run. It's the most complex. So I know nobody doesn't really want to watch the A walk, but you see him pick the speed up. His foot speed's okay. His foot and how he's controlling it's okay. There are probably some other issues going on. But again, you can see with the no arms, you can see the foot strike slightly in front of the hip, right? And you can argue whether different coaching tells whether it's right underneath the hip, whether it's 6 to 8 inches in front, it's somewhere in that in between, right? As long as it's not out in front, or it's out too far out in front, or it's in behind. But you see a vertical emphasis in his posture, right? You see a good swing position, right? All those different things we're trying to project and emulate with elite level sprinters and their full speed, the whole part method of what we're teaching, right? Now this kid's going to pop up a little bit some of the videos, and I'll explain what some of his differences and issues are, because he does have some outlier facts, and we'll talk about that. We've mentioned a little bit about bandwidths and shapes and how they differ, right? Boom booms, another drill that I personally love. I first learned from Ken Clark, again, not my idea, not my original thought, right? But I think they have the biggest bang for their buck in terms of the drilling and be able to get speed and velocity and elastic qualities in terms of repping the drills, right? But the biggest drill they're going to have, the biggest piece of the sprint phase that I think field athletes struggle in is a mid-stance phase, right? Being able to get to that touchdown, getting those knees closer together, getting to that figure 4 position. Because if they're late in their gait, what do you see with most field athletes, football players specifically, going to do? Their hips are going to go behind. Because of that, they're going to retard their swing leg, right? So it's going to slow down. It's going to get out behind them. Cam Jossie talked about in his presentation on Saturday. And what they're going to do is that swing leg's going to get through late. They're going to heel strike and they're going to pull through, right? It's going to retard that next cycle. It's going to slow them down and create braking forces, right? So boom booms emphasize front side mechanics, lower limb positioning, as we know about that angular velocity in the 2-mass model, right? And for me, this is probably where I get the most creative in my drill variations based off what I see with the kids, because you can get a lot of bang for your buck, and like I talked about earlier, right? And just remember, before you watch this video, the more unstable we make the upper body, the more perfect the lower body has to, the more the lower body, perfect the lower body has to respond. I apologize. But you see here is this kid had sagged his hips, was notorious for reaching for lines and creating braking forces. So this was another return to play athlete I worked with in the summer. But we're trying to create a pre-tensioning in the ankle, stiff ground reaction forces. The stick, again, pressing overhead is going to be lateral sling. And as we're adding a movement piece to it, as we're increasing the intensity and complexity of the drill, we're changing the environment. And we're forcing him to get an upright posture, that foot to strike, and we're trying to get a good hip lock position to force that swing leg to come through in the position it's supposed to teach him those attractor patterns we're looking for. So when he gets in those positions where he wants to reach or do those things, his body neurologically, he's going to know to get to those attractor positions, right? To get to those golden positions within his bandwidth, right? Let's see if this next one will load. Apologize. Again, same thing. Right, a little bit of a pogo again, because we're changing the drill, because we're taking the stick away, we're giving some form of a hurdle, we're changing the environment, right? So we're giving another fluctuation to it. And all we're doing is the same thing. His arms are okay, being a defensive end, and, you know, he's pretty damn fast for a D end at a group of 5 school. He's like a mid to high 4.6, right? But we're forced with that. We're giving tactile feedback with the hurdle. And what we're doing is we're forcing that swing leg to suck up underneath, because we want a short swing leg to create angular velocity, to create higher ground reaction forces. Because we know the first half of ground contact is where we get those peak vertical forces and ground reaction forces based off the 2-mass model research, right? So it's the same concept, different drill, different environment, right? But we're still training the same attractor position, the mid stance phase, that mid stance phase and that positioning phase and that hip lock, right? Those attractive positions we're looking for. Now you start talking about, first off, I want to appreciate, because I'm awful with getting consistent recorded videos and trying to focus on the kids and getting a new phone over the last year. So I lost a bunch of videos. I want to say I appreciate you to my buddy, John Garris. I hope you're watching now. If not, I'll ask if you watch later. For giving me a video. He does some great stuff in terms of motor learning and drill work, right? But again, you see the plate, you're like, what the hell is the kid standing on the plate for, right? Well, when we talked about the stumble reflex, or anytime we change the environment, we put the body in a position where it thinks it's falling, or the ground is raised or lowered, or it's a softer surface or a harder surface than what it's expecting, or forcing a pre-tensioning in the ankle. And when we know that pre-tensioning in the ankle, we're going to get higher ground reaction forces. What does that mean? It means more vertical forces, right? So I'll go ahead and play the video and shut up, right? But again, you can see it, his forceful stiff contact, the stiff ankle contact, right? We'll watch it one more time, maybe, right? Again, because we're raising the ground, right? We're raising and the lowering the ground. And for the next rep, I'd tell the kid to flip around so we even them out a little bit. But again, the ground's lowered on one side, it's raising the other side. So the body's being forced to change to a neurological adaptation, right? And pretense, because the floor isn't the density it expects it to be, and it isn't where it's supposed to be, right? So we're producing a fight or flight response based off the stumble reflex. Right? Now, another drill that I personally love is straight leg bounds, right? Because they help with ground contact, elasticity, pre-tensioning in the ankle complex, lower shank positioning, and that's that shin, that ankle, and relative to the hip. Again, when they do all those things, they limit deformation in the Achilles and ankle complex by strengthening elasticity in the ankle, right? And all these different things. Also, I know these, again, I think they're just great drills overall, no matter if you vary them for motor learning and overspeed or not, right? But another piece of it is it builds specific strength in the hamstrings at a length that we're not able to train a whole lot unless we're going to specific methods in that fully lengthened position at high speeds, right? And again, the same thing, you can do all the different variabilities. The video I have isn't a varied motor learning wise, I'll show you next. But all these different variations can be done, you can do with a straight leg bound, But I think using the arms, you get a bit of a greater impulse. So I probably use these more regularly. But I think the ability of the overspeed effect and the ankle complex and the hamstrings and glute, I think shouldn't be forgotten from a motor standpoint, specific strength standpoint, right? Because the idea is you're going to whip from the hip. I don't want to see a lot of knee bend. Again, I want to credit my buddy Austin with a great video demonstration of some of the soccer girls from a few years ago. Because again, I'm awful with losing videos when getting new phones and breaking phones and recording videos as a whole, right? But what you can see is, right, is a vertical posture in nature. They're whipping from the hip. They're using elastic reflexes in the glute and hamstring, with most field sports athlete can't use. So it's a great motor learning idea. And all these different variations we've talked about today and we kind of hit on a watch, you can use them here, right? Again, I just want to give you guys some ideas of how to do these different things and incorporate them. Another way that I personally like to use it a ton from a motor learning standpoint, limiting velocities early on in the off season, or just giving positions for just giving the opportunity for the kids to learn, right? Or some fly 10 variations, right? So a variation I could use could be hands out in front, a stick overhead, and then lastly, I'm always going to reset the kid with a free run because I want the highest neurological stressor to be last, because I want the body to adapt to that stressor, right? Just like if we PR, right? I'm going to shut the kid down after the PR, maybe not. But let's say if you go off of Charlie Francis' principle, he's going to PR. As soon as they PR, they're done for the day, because you want the body, the brain to adapt to that stimulus, right? So that's my process of why I always finish the complex or whatever it is with a free run, right? Another variation I've used that I like a lot based off some of the motor learning patterns we've talked about is wicked variations, right? You could do the first and second rep, right? You can shorten the spaces. You can improve front side lift, limb positioning, right? A faster limb, because we know if we shorten the spaces on wickets from standard positioning, right? One, we're going to limit velocity. So it's not going to be as neurally taxing, arguably, right? But we also know because of that, things are going to happen faster. If we give a different environmental context to the situation, it's a new environment, it's a new fluctuation. So from there, we can force that swing leg to come through faster. And we know if we create higher velocities in that swing leg and better angular velocity, we can get higher ground reaction force. So that's the idea there, right? And then from there, you can potentiate it and you can give them normal spacing, right? It's still an environment for them to learn and get maximal hip projection, all those different things. And the great thing is about these drills is they're self-organizing. That's another part between all this is you want to be able to give the kids opportunities to learn for themselves and not necessarily rehearse. Now, if they can't hit those positions, coach the hell out of it, right? But the best drills are the ones where the athletes can figure it out themselves. Because when they can figure it out themselves, they're going to be more likely to use it and get to it. And again, the third, fourth rep, depending on how they're looking at what your yard is and all these different things you're trying to do for the day, the fourth rep, again, the highest and hardest neural stress, give it last. So there's an adaptation, right? So they can part, hold, put it all together. Good, you're done for the day, right? See if we can get this thing rolling. Maybe. All right. So again, same kid. This kid was I worked with in the fall. Previously, in the last 2 years, he came off an ACL, and then he ended up coming from a meniscus repair, which is a long process when they repair it anyways. But this is early. I think it was about week 3, week 4. We first kind of got into our fly 10s a little bit. I think it was like our first or second rep ever we did with it, right? And I know with this kid, he's a typical football player. He's a squatty runner. He's a pusher. He doesn't have great reflexive responses in his hamstring and glute. He runs a 0.98. Now, for a kid healthy, he ran a 4.56, right? So that's pretty damn fast, right? On laser, right? On fly 10, we got the video of that too. I didn't put it in here because it wasn't really what we were talking about. But if you watch toe off, right, you can see him push, right, using low back and quad and not using his hamstring glute. And how I know that is because if I look, that's like within a split second of toe off. Look at the distal portion of his hamstring in relation to his glute. Look how far behind him it is, because a great toe off position is going to allow for maximal vertical force production and allow that hip to raise. So that hamstring should be directly underneath the hip, and instead it's behind. So I know he's trying to push instead of bounce. Great athletes and great spinners bounce down the field when they sprint, right? And then what do I do? And because of that, realistically, the next rep, I really should have him run hands overhead, but I had him go arms. I had him go no arms as he entered the gates. He ran a 1.0. It's 0.2 of a difference. Again, it's not super fast, but I provided an environment and an attractive position and a prime attractive position we want to hit for him to learn and get to those positions. You can see a little bit of an increased hip projection, right? Giving us an idea of better vertical forces. right? You can see less lean, but you also see him lean at the second because he was a running back. And what are running backs taught to do? Get behind their pads or run behind their pads. So that's the idea of why a lot of these guys lean and push, right? But you see it limits a little bit, right? It gets a little bit better. And then again, what I say in the last potentiation cycles, the last one, we're gonna reset them, right? We're gonna put it all together, whole method, right? Again, he runs a 9.6. That's a 1/10 of a second off his lifetime best, right? And this was in a month of returning to sprinting, right? A month, 4 or 5 weeks, somewhere in there. I don't think it's quite 3. I wouldn't give a fly 10 kid. I wouldn't give a fly 10 to a kid that early, right? But you can see an improved hip projection, improved toe off position, right? You can see that hamstring in a better relation to the glute when he gets the toe off, right? You can see it, you start putting a little bit together. He's a little less in his gait. He's able to get a little bit closer to that figure 4. When you get the touchdown, you watch a lot of these kids. The biggest thing you can watch outside of toe off is watch the knee separation, because right when they get the touchdown, the closer their knees are together, the better position they're going to be, because that means they're getting better projection, and the more likely they're going to be able to get that swing leg through, right? Because we don't want to be late in our gait, right? And again, this wasn't a part of the potentiation. This was a day where we were kind of tapering, trying to get him to higher velocities, right? And he ties his PR. This was 5, I think this was like 6, 7 weeks. This was right before he went home for break. He ran a 0.95, which is a tie of his fly 10 PR, right? And you can see an increase in maximal hip projection. You can see a better toe off position. You can see him get to a better hip lock position, right? Where he can push and extend and create all those reflex and ground reaction forces, all those different things you're doing, right? And you see less push, and you can see more bounce, right? Because he was a twitchy enough kid, right? And to be honest, looking back at him and looking back at his numbers the other day, I wish I would have put him in here, but looking back during this cycle, we PR'd his 10. He went from a 1.53 to a 1.51. His 20, we went from a 2.71 to a 2.67. Went to a 2.67, and we tied his fly 10. And honestly, trying to incorporate so many things you have to do in return to play. If I would have tapered his volume in the weight room a little bit better just to get a PR in this day, he probably would have PR'd, right? But again, his volume in a cycle where we would do some of this was probably a little higher than what we would do in a normal sprint cycle like that in a team setting. But he had so many other needs, but it was still impressive to see him tie in such a maximal high neural component under possibly a potential little bit of fatigue. Now, wicked distances, right? Because there's such an idea for motor learning and self-organization that fall under the umbrella for football and field sport athletes over speed, right? I'm not going to pretend I know any of this stuff. A lot of the stuff for me is under trial and error, watching Coach Garasio, Austin Ardrey, coaches I've learned from, Coach Jackson, watching him from afar, talking to him a little bit. Vince, but to be honest, if I had to tell you one thing to take away in terms of wickets, look at Vince Anderson, Altus. Chris Corfus has some specific distances. I could put him in here. If you ask, I can give them to you. Chris Corfus has some specific distances for different outcomes he's looking for and problem solving he's looking for. And then honestly, trial and error. And I've heard it a lot today, coach's eye, right? The coach's eye is going to tell you a ton, right? I'm always going to go shorter before I progress to longer. I'd rather them look like they're running through tires and look like they're pushing, extending, and they pull a hamstring. I can always lengthen them, right? Don't pull the cake out too early, right? Keep it in there, cook it all the way through, right? Now, some ideas. Here's the first time this kid specifically, and I'm showing him a lot because he was a kid I made a point to try to get some videos on with some of the ideas I was working with, right? You can see an early stage return to play where one, it's a 20-yard build. It's not great in terms of maximum velocity. Let's see if it loads. But the idea is you start getting him into these attractive positions and providing some of these neural outputs he needed to get to in terms of the stimulus effect to see if it loads, right? But I use the wickets, again, for self-organization, for motor learning patterns. And again, the idea of I'm not so worried about the time because I know the time is not going to be as fast as a true fly 10, or I'll speed it up just a little bit, right? But I put the Browers on it because it drives intent, right? It gives a little bit more idea because I want it to be a maximal rep. I don't want it to be an extensive sub-maximal rep. So I put the Browers out because he knows he's being timed. He's going to run a little bit harder. And you can see him get, and to be honest, watching that first step, his next rep, if I had it on video, I probably would have told him to scoot up from the back of the end zone, probably take 2 steps up to get a yard closer so he's not reaching for that first wicket, right? Just to self-organize, right? Because the idea is you want him to touch down in the middle of each wicket, right? And you don't want him to be too far in front, too far behind in between the spacing, right? But the same idea is you want to see him get a good front side lift, good toe off, and get to that figure 4 position during the stance phase. And the wickets give you an opportunity to do that. Another way I've used wickets, right, is an extensive wicket ladder on tempo days. I've started like with some of our return to play kids I work with, and specifically this kid here, I used it a ton. we build it into our volume. And again, it's an opportunity to strengthen and expose them to those attractor positions and let them organize, right? Overspeed is more than just towing. It's about training the body and some of the dynamic system theories. Again, normally when it's more of a maximal rep, I'm going to keep the amount of wickets down from 4 to 6. And then when it's an extensive and I want them to feel the positions and get a little bit better up, I'm going to use 10 to 12, right? And you can see the idea. And now he's going to do maybe 1, 2, 3, 4 reps of this. And then he's going to finish his tempo session, right? And it's going to count into his volume, right? And you're still looking for all those same things, still trying to get all those different positions. All right, let's see if I missed one. Nope. All right, now let's talk about some plyometric considerations, because I know there are some arguments you could argue they're overspeed, there aren't overspeed. But the idea is there's some pieces you can do to plyometric considerations in terms of the ankle complex you do that carry over, right? 80% of what's happening is sprinting, roughly over 8 meters a second. It's happening in the ankle complex, right? It's actually, so it's going to be more tendon and fascial ligament base, and it is going to be muscular base, right? 80% of what's happening over 8 meters a second is going to be in the ankle complex, right? So when we're looking at these different plyometric considerations, the carry over to top speed and maximal efforts, we want the ground contacts to be 0.1 or less, right? Because otherwise you're going to start getting an argument of different variations, right? And these are some videos we did in our team setting, right, from last summer at CSU, right? We're going to do some resisted pogos, right? We're giving extra force to that eccentric point, forcing a stiffer contact, a stiffer spring, higher ground reaction forces, all those different things to prep that ankle, right? And you want to limit knee bend, all those different things, right? Because you want the force and you want the force production of re-injuring, excuse me, the re-emphasizing and a considerable portion of the force to be in the ankle, right? You don't want to be in the quad and the hamstring. Right, now you look at some overspeed pogos, some assisted pogos, right? These are straight from Tony Holler and TFC, right? You're increasing kinetic energy off the increase in flight time, right? There's gonna be a larger eccentric load. And again, because we know from the 2-mass model, the idea of speeding up how much force comes down in that lower shank in the first half of ground contact, and the ability to limit deformation in the Achilles complex, we can increase ground reaction forces. So how fast can they increase their energy and then come back to earth, stop it, and reapply it, right? Now, you can take the same drill and apply the stumble reflex, right? Because we know that's that oh shit moment, right? To where they have to organize because they think they're falling, right? And what's going to happen is it's going to force a stiffer contact, a stiffer ankle complex. We know that's going to produce a stiffer spring, a stiffer ground reaction forces, and providing a fight or flight response to create increased velocities and overall in sprinting. And we can do this in our prep work. All these different things play a different role. The biggest piece in overspeed is for us in a team sport, a team athlete, all the stuff you can carry over your drills, everything you do is the idea of motor learning, just from a practicality standpoint in a team setting, right? Another thing you can talk about session organization that I play with a ton, and in a team setting we've done a little bit in the last 2 years with Coach Gracio, right? Is if you rehearse it and it becomes organized and it becomes monotonous, right? And you can talk about where it's programmed in the athletes, all these different things, right? You can get to a conversation down the rabbit hole about choking, right? And rehearse reps, because the athletes have to be able to organize, right? But think about it. If you're right-handed and you brush your teeth with your left hand, or say if you always drive the same way home the other day, tomorrow drive home a different way and see how much more you have to focus and how much harder it is, right? It's not going to be incredibly taxing, like you're going to get home, you're going to be zonked, right? But think how much more you have to focus and pay attention. The body has to organize and figure out what's going on, right? So if I have 4 reps of boom booms, right? And I know I have 4 total reps, so I got it down and back twice, right? Every time I do a boom boom, once they get technical mastery, once the team or the group or the kid gets technical mastery, I might start changing it to where if I know those 4 drills, those 4 reps, I'm going to change it. One's going to be hands overhead. One's going to be arms across the body. One, every time he does a switch, I want to press his arms overhead, right? You're trying to expose them to fluctuations, because the more they're able to get those attractors in a fluctuation, the more they're exposed to those fluctuations, the more they're going to be able to get to them in higher velocities and higher demanding pieces, right? Another piece I've played with, I've yet to decide if I fully like it or not. I think it has a place, and I've used it a little bit with some return to play kids. Depending on your practicality of how you program your days and differences like that, you could flip your order of your exercises on a field session. You could do some change of direction, then come and do your Excel work, or you could do your Excel work and then you can do your excel work, and then do your change of direction work. Depending on how you break your days up, it needs a lot of return to play guys that have to kind of intermix it, because you have to adapt it for sports, adapting to the demands of the sport and practice and different things. You could rotate that. I think for honestly the best bang for your buck in terms of motor learning, in terms of getting maximal output and all these different stressors, I think it's going to be in your drill work, right? But remember, like I said earlier, if we always rehearse it the same exact way and it becomes robotic and rehearsed, right? The athletes forget how to problem solve. And we know when they get out there in the game, the sport and all these different things, and other schools, there could be 100,000 fans screaming. They're not going to hear you be able to say knees up, toe up, jump over the front leg, right? All these different cues you're going to use, right? So they have to be able to organize, right? And the faster we can get to these attractors and make these things happen, the more likely they are to be able to use them. We're going to be able to get optimal development out of these kids in production. All right, so again, as we're kind of wrapping up and doing these different things, remember, if we're providing a resource for new fluctuations, new environments, for things that happen faster, to improve mastery of technical positions, and limiting coaching cues and improving the athletes to figure things out in self-organization, right? That all falls under the umbrella of overspeed and dynamic systems, right? All those different things kind of fall under the same umbrella. So I want to kind of broaden and force people to think, and including myself, about what all these different ideas really are, right? And why do all these concepts of overspeed work, right? We force the body to operate at a faster rate because we're changing the environment. We can increase ground reaction forces. We're decreasing deformation and ground contact. The stumble reflex, we're increasing the stiffening of the spring, tapping into the brain's fight or flight response, right? And motor learning, because we're changing the environment, and we're chill training those attractive positions, and we're changing the environment, the fluctuations, to get them to be the more use those attractors when they get to different positions, right? And to recap, right? Think outside the box. Don't follow the norm, right? Don't do what everybody else does just because they've done it for so long and it works, right? If it works, like, success leaves clues, but also do the research, look for answers for your own, look where people are getting success from, ask why they're getting it, right? And again, like, to get off that, never stop asking why, right? I think that's probably people hate me and love me early on and getting annoying, is you want to know why, you want to learn, right? And then lastly, again, some problems aren't always fixed from the ground up, right? Just how do we fix problems from the top down? Because again, we know neural stimulus, neural adaptation comes from the brain. So how do we train the brain, and how do we get to respond better to these different environments, right? Again, if you need any of my information, you want to ask me questions, tell me I'm flat out wrong, I'm an idiot, whatever you want to do. Or if you just want to ask me questions, or if you want this presentation, I can send it to you. All my contact info is here. I appreciate you guys for taking time to listen and hanging around. I know this is the last presentation of the day. And one last thank you. I would like to thank my dad. He's my biggest mentor, my biggest form of support I've had. He had a massive heart attack back early in the fall during the middle of the season. And I know for him, I wouldn't be where I was without him. And I know hopefully, I think he was supposed to watch. He said he was going to. So I'd like to publicly thank him and say without him, I wouldn't be here. And I know he just had his 55th birthday after a massive heart surgery. And it's a blessing for him to be here and for me to continue to lean on him and learn from him. Because like I said, if he wasn't here, I don't know where I would be. All right, I appreciate you guys, and thank you for your time.
Crushed it, Zach.
Anybody still listening or watching?
Yeah, no, we still got about 35, 33 people on YouTube watching.
No kidding.
Go into the comments. I'm not finding any questions. But just to ask some of the rotational stuff, I mean, kind of going back to like nearly the beginning of your presentation, I've had this, been sitting on this question. I don't know if you have any drills or cueing and stuff to either fight or that specifically tailor towards rotation or anti-rotation when you're doing sprinting drills, if you have anything about that.
Again, when you think about sprinting, there's a rotational component to it. But when you think about what's happening, when you think about what's happening within those rotations and what's happening and the demands of the sport, the demands of the event and what you're trying to do, the body wants to rotate because it's getting a production of torque and it's allowing that spine to load. You can get deep down the rabbit hole about co-contractions and all these different things to providing a neural response and create more force, right? So some rotation and some force is good, but you have to look at where that rotation is coming from and why it's coming, right? Because if you see people kind of swing like this when they run, watch their feet, right? Because you talk about the lateral sling, right? I don't want my athletes to run on a tightrope And if they're running on their tightrope and that right leg is walking too far across the body, across the midline, they might swing with their left like this. So is it really an anti-rotation issue? No, it's a gait problem. It's a biomechanical pattern problem. The swing leg, all in touchdown and lateral sling, all these different things, right? So you got to look at it and look at the full-fledged of what's going on in terms of that down below and above and piece it all together. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's how I would look at it.
Solid. All right, I'm good. I think that's all the questions we have at this time.
I think everybody's about done.
Appreciate it, Coach. I'll take back over. Again, thank you to everybody who participated and watched, asked questions. Again, all this information will be posted later, and you can go back and rewatch it on YouTube, and all the presentations and slides will be available upon request. Thank you to everybody who participated and all the presenters. I hope everybody has a good day.